The morning Thomas Hartwell died, the sky above the ranch was perfectly clear. That was the detail that stayed with Evelyn longest. Not the sound of his breathing changing in the night, not the moment she understood what that change meant, not even the faces of her children when she came down the stairs and couldn't find the words. It was the sky. Brilliant, cold, indifferent blue stretching from one ridge to the other as if nothing had happened at all. As if the world hadn't just come apart at its center. Thomas had been sick for 7 months. A thing that started as a cough and became something the doctor in Billings could name but couldn't fix. They'd had time, or what felt like time, enough for Thomas to sit with each child and say the things a father tries to say, enough for Evelyn to hold his hand through the worst nights and pretend she wasn't terrified of what came after. Enough time to believe she had prepared herself. She hadn't. The ranch, 240 acres in the foothills east of Caldwell Creek, Montana, had been in the Hartwell name for 18 years. Thomas had broken that land himself, built the house board by board, planted the windbreak of cottonwoods along the north fence. He'd registered the deed, paid the taxes, kept every paper in a lockbox under the bed, with the kind of careful pride that comes from a man who grew up with nothing and understood what documentation meant. That lockbox was the first thing Garland Hartwell took. Garland was Thomas's younger brother by 4 years, and his opposite in nearly every way. Thomas had been patient. Garland was impatient. Where Thomas saved, Garland spent. Where Thomas built, Garland maneuvered. He'd shown up at the ranch 2 days after the funeral wearing a black suit that was too clean for the occasion and a look on his face that Evelyn recognized immediately, though she couldn't have named it then. She could name it now. It was a man confirming that what he'd been waiting for had finally arrived. "We need to talk about the arrangements," he'd said, standing in her kitchen like he owned it already. Evelyn had been feeding the youngest, Clara, who was 4 and didn't fully understand what was happening. And she'd told him they could talk in the evening, after the children were settled. He'd agreed, nodded pleasantly. And sometime in those intervening hours, while Evelyn sat with her 6 children in the front room and tried to answer the questions she couldn't answer, Garland had gone into the bedroom and taken the lockbox. She hadn't noticed for 3 days. There was too much else to notice. When she finally went looking for it and found it gone, she went straight to Garland and asked him directly. He'd smiled at her, a slow, almost gentle smile. "I don't know what you're talking about, Evelyn. What lockbox?" That was 6 weeks ago. But what followed happened faster than she could track it, which she suspected was intentional. A lawyer she'd never met arrived from Helena with papers she didn't recognize. The deed to the ranch, he explained, was held jointly under the Hartwell name. And as Thomas's surviving male heir, Garland had primary claim. There was documentation. There were signatures. There was a letter supposedly in Thomas's hand transferring management of all assets to his brother in the event of death. Evelyn had stared at that letter for a long time. She knew Thomas's handwriting. She'd read his letters for 18 years. The cramped, careful way he made his R's. The way the last letter of every word trailed slightly downward. The signature on that paper had neither of those things. But the lawyer seemed unconcerned with her opinion, and the county magistrate, a man named Poole, who had done business with Garland's associates for years, had already reviewed the documents and found them satisfactory. She'd gone to the only other lawyer in Caldwell Creek, a young man named Abbott, who was 2 years out of law school and visibly uncomfortable the moment she mentioned Garland's name. "Mrs. Hartwell," he'd said carefully, "even if what you're suggesting about those documents is true, and I'm not saying it isn't, proving forgery takes time and resources. It takes witnesses. It takes—" "I have 6 children," she said. He'd looked at his desk. "I understand. But without the original deed, without the lockbox contents you described, you'd be asking a court to take your word against documentation that's already been reviewed and accepted. The legal position here is—" He'd paused. "Difficult." She didn't have the money for a prolonged legal fight. She'd understood that before she sat down in Abbott's office. Thomas had left some savings, enough to see them through a year if she was careful, but Garland moved faster than a year. He petitioned the court for immediate possession of the property, citing outstanding debts against the estate. Debts Evelyn had never heard of, against creditors she'd never met. The magistrate granted the petition. They had 2 weeks to vacate. She told the children on a Sunday evening. She'd put Clara and 5-year-old Josiah to bed first, then sat down in the kitchen with the 4 older ones. Daniel, who was 15 and already had his father's jaw and his father's silences. Margaret, 13, steady and careful, and her mother's daughter. Henry, 11, who processed everything through anger and couldn't quite meet her eyes. And Ruth, who was 9 and had been watching Evelyn's face for weeks with an expression too old for her age. "We have to leave the ranch," Evelyn said. She didn't soften it. They deserved the truth. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Where are we going?" "I'm working on that." "What does that mean?" "It means I don't know yet, Daniel. It means I'm trying to figure it out." He looked at the table. She watched his hands tighten around his coffee cup. He'd taken to drinking coffee in the weeks since his father died, and she hadn't had the heart to tell him he was too young for it. "Uncle Garland," he said, not a question. "Yes." Henry shoved back from the table hard enough to make his chair scrape. "He can't do that. It's our house. Papa built this house." "I know. So how can he just—" "Henry." She said it quietly, the way that worked with him. He stopped, breathing hard through his nose. "I know how it feels. I feel it too. But right now I need us to hold together. Can you do that for me?" He didn't answer, but he didn't leave the table. Margaret had been sitting very still. "What are we going to do for money?" she asked. "Practical, always practical. I have some. Not enough for long, but some." Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "I have some ideas. I'm going to figure this out." She was not, at that moment, sure she believed that, but she said it and watched her children's faces and understood that sometimes what you say and what you believe have to be 2 different things. They left the ranch on a Thursday morning. The temperature was 11 degrees and dropping. Evelyn had packed what she could: clothing, blankets, the children's things, a box of food, the few items of value she'd managed to secure before Garland's lawyer arrived to inventory the house. She had $260 in cash tucked into her coat lining, which she told no one about. The wagon was Thomas's old freight rig, and the horse pulling it, a gray mare named Biscuit, was technically Garland's property now under the court's ruling, but no one came out to stop her taking it. Daniel drove. He was 15 and handled the reins with the quiet competence of a boy who'd been learning it since he could hold them. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench with Clara in her lap and didn't look back at the house. She almost made it. 100 yards down the ranch road, Clara twisted around to look behind them and said, "Mama, where's home going?" Evelyn didn't answer. She pressed her cheek against the top of her daughter's head and watched the road and didn't say anything at all. She had no plan beyond reaching town and buying time. She'd sent a letter 2 weeks prior to a cousin in Butte, but hadn't received an answer. She'd spoken to Reverend Mullins at the church in Caldwell Creek, who had expressed sympathy and offered prayers and mentioned a widow's fund that he believed had some money in it, perhaps $15 or $20. She had asked around, carefully, without showing desperation, because desperation was the thing that made people take advantage, about room rental, about work. The town's response had been gentle and ultimately useless. Caldwell Creek was a small place, 340 souls, and most of those souls were careful not to involve themselves in business that touched the Hartwells. Garland had been building influence in that county for years, long before Thomas died. He'd lent money to men who couldn't repay it, which meant he owned their compliance. He'd done favors for the magistrate and several members of the town council. He was the kind of man who understood that the best power was the kind that never had to show itself. When Evelyn arrived in town with her 6 children and a wagon, she found that she had fewer friends than she'd thought. Mrs. Copeland at the dry goods store let her park the wagon behind the building and didn't charge her for it. Old Hector Finley at the livery agreed to keep Biscuit in exchange for Daniel mucking stalls in the morning. The Creekside Hotel's owner, a widow herself named Augusta Pratt, offered a room at reduced rate, $2 a night, which was still more than Evelyn could sustain. She'd been in town 11 days when the letter arrived. It was addressed to her in Garland's handwriting, delivered by his lawyer. The letter informed her that, as her husband's estate remained in process, and as she had not demonstrated the financial means to independently house and provision her 6 children, Garland Hartwell was petitioning the court to assume custodial authority over the children until such time as Evelyn could prove her capability as a provider. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Evelyn read the letter 3 times in the small hotel room while her children slept around her. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into her coat, and sat in the chair by the window looking out at the dark street below for a long time. She had known he would do this eventually. She had known, in the part of herself she tried not to listen to, that taking the land was not the end of it. Garland didn't want the land, or rather, he wanted the land, but the land wasn't the point. The point was the elimination of every inconvenient reminder that Thomas had existed, had built something, had chosen someone else over family. The children were Thomas's children. Their faces were Thomas's face. Garland would not stop until they were gone. She didn't sleep that night. Tuesday morning came in gray and bitter, with ice on every surface and a wind that found every gap in your coat. Evelyn dressed the children carefully, their best clothes, their cleanest faces. She braided Margaret's hair and Ruth's hair and left Clara's in soft curls the way Thomas had liked. She made sure Daniel and Henry had their collars straight and Josiah's boots were buttoned. Then she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and tried to see what the court would see. A widow, 34 years old, with good cheekbones and tired eyes, and a coat that was showing at the cuffs. She looked capable, she thought. She hoped she looked capable. The county building was 4 blocks from the hotel. They walked in a line, Evelyn at the front, Clara on her hip, the others behind. People on the street watched them pass. Some looked away. One woman, Eleanor Marsh, who had been a friend, or what Evelyn had taken for a friend, made eye contact briefly and then found something interesting to look at in a shop window. Evelyn kept walking. Garland was already in the hearing room when they arrived, flanked by his lawyer and 2 other men she didn't recognize. He was wearing the same black suit. He nodded at her when she came in, a calm nod, almost pleasant. She didn't nod back. The magistrate, Poole, came in and settled himself with the slow deliberateness of a man who knew he was the most important person in the room. He reviewed the petition. He asked Evelyn a series of questions in a voice that managed to be both bored and condescending. What were her financial resources? What was her plan for housing? How did she propose to provide for 6 children on her own? She answered each question directly. She gave him the numbers, the cash she had, the arrangement at the livery, the possibility of work. She was honest because she suspected anything less than honesty would be used against her immediately. Poole listened, or appeared to listen. When she finished, he spent a long moment looking at his papers. The court's primary concern, he said, is the welfare of the children. Mrs. Hartwell, your situation, while sympathetic, does not at present represent the kind of stable provision that the court requires. My children are fed and housed at a hotel on temporary funds, he said. That is not a stable situation. I need time to find work. I need Mrs. Hartwell. He looked up then, and his eyes were patient and immovable. The court will take the matter under advisement. In the meantime, he shuffled papers, cleared his throat. Given the circumstances and given the petition before us, the court sees fit to expedite matters. What followed took her completely off guard, and she understood later that this was the intention. There had been no realistic path through that hearing room. Garland had arranged things too carefully. The outcome had been decided before she walked in. The magistrate did not grant the petition outright. What he did was worse. He ruled that given the unsettled state of the estate and the unclear financial situation, the children could not be guaranteed adequate care under the current arrangements. He therefore ordered that the matter be resolved immediately, not by separating the children, not yet, but by placing them through what he called a public arrangement process. An auction of indenture, effectively, though he didn't use that word. The town would be given the opportunity to take in the children, individually or as a unit, providing care in exchange for their labor until they came of age or until Evelyn reestablished herself financially. That is not legal, Evelyn said. She said it very quietly. Mrs. Hartwell, this is a practical solution to an urgent problem. You are proposing to auction my children. The room was very quiet. Garland's lawyer wrote something on his notepad. Garland himself was looking out the window. Poole's expression didn't change. The arrangement is in the children's best interest. She wanted to scream. She held it down by main force. They are my children, my husband's children. I will not. The proceeding will be held this Friday, Poole said, and closed his folder. Good day, Mrs. Hartwell. None. She fought it. She went back to Abbott's office that afternoon and stood in his doorway and told him what had happened and watched his face go carefully neutral. Evelyn, he said, even if the order is improper, and it may be, I'd need to look at the statutes, we're 3 days from Friday. There's no circuit judge within writing distance right now. The nearest appeals process, 3 days, she said. He looked genuinely pained. He was not a bad man. He was simply a careful one, and careful men did not help in situations like this. I'll write a letter of protest. I'll file it with the territorial office. But the timeline is 3 days, she said again. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Abbott. She walked out. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a moment. A man she didn't know walked past her without noticing she was there. Down the street, 2 boys were throwing snowballs at a fence post and laughing. Somewhere above the mountains, the sun was still up there, though you'd never know it from the gray of the sky. She went back to the hotel and told the children they were going for a walk. She took them to the diner on 2nd Street and spent 50 cents she couldn't afford on pie and coffee and milk, and she let them talk and eat and be loud in the way children are when they're allowed to relax. And she watched their faces and tried to memorize them the way she found herself memorizing Thomas's face in those last weeks. She was not going to let this happen. She had no idea how she was going to stop it. Bye. Friday came. The auction, because that's what it was, regardless of the magistrate's language, was held in the street in front of the county building. Evelyn had been informed the previous evening. There was no further legal recourse. Abbott's letter of protest had been received, acknowledged, and noted for future consideration, which meant nothing. She dressed the children the same way she had for the hearing, their best, their cleanest. This time she had to explain to them what was happening. Margaret already understood. She was 13 and she'd been listening to everything. Daniel understood. Henry's eyes went flat and dangerous in the way she feared. Josiah asked if they were in trouble. Clara asked if they could have breakfast first. They had breakfast, toast and eggs at the diner because she wanted them to eat. And she wanted them to remember that she had fed them, that she had not let that lapse even at the end. The street was already gathering people when they came out. It was 8 in the morning and well below freezing. The townspeople of Caldwell Creek had turned out in numbers that surprised Evelyn. Not from sympathy, she understood, but from the particular frontier combination of civic duty and spectacle. An auction was news. An auction of a widow's children in the middle of winter was something people would talk about for years. Garland was there, standing with his lawyer and several men who Evelyn recognized as his business associates. He watched her come down the street with an expression of careful neutrality. He looked, she thought, like a man watching a transaction complete itself. The magistrate's deputy ran the proceeding. He stood on the steps of the county building with papers in his hand and spoke in a carrying voice about the circumstances and the court's arrangement and the opportunity for upstanding citizens to provide homes for these children. He made it sound almost charitable. Evelyn stood in the cold with her 6 children around her and said nothing. She had decided sometime in the night that she would not beg. She would not give Garland or the crowd or anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing her beg. Whatever happened here, she would stand up through it. Bidding started slowly. There were interested parties. She'd known there would be. Frontier families often needed labor, and children old enough to work were a practical commodity, however ugly that reality was. A couple wanted Ruth, specifically. They had no children of their own, and the wife had been watching Ruth since they arrived. A farmer on the edge of town made an offer for Daniel and Henry together, noting they were old enough to be useful. A woman from the church said she would take Clara and Josiah. Each bid landed on Evelyn like something physical. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She watched her children's faces and did not let herself look at anything else. Margaret moved closer to her and took her hand. Evelyn held it. "Mama," Margaret said quietly. "I know," Evelyn said. "I know." The deputy was tallying bids, trying to work out how to split the children in a way the bidders found acceptable. The crowd was involved now, in the way crowds get when something human and awful is happening. Some people were uncomfortable. Some were engaged. Some were watching Garland, who stood very still. Then, from the back of the crowd, someone spoke. "I'll take all of them." The voice was unhurried, not loud but carrying, the kind of voice that had learned in some contexts that required it, how to make itself heard without raising itself. Several people turned. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was somewhere around 40, broad in the shoulders, with a face that was brown from weather and had a quality of stillness to it that was different from Garland's stillness. Garland's stillness was the stillness of a man waiting for something. This was the stillness of a man who had already waited and come out the other side. He was not someone Evelyn recognized. He was dressed for cold work, heavy coat, worn boots, no pretense to it. His hat was pulled down against the wind. The deputy looked up from his papers. "Sir, the current total for placement of all 6 children." "I heard it," the man said. "I said I'll take all of them." He looked at the deputy. "That includes the mother." The murmur in the crowd was immediate. Garland, for the first time since Evelyn had arrived, moved. Not much, just a slight shift of his weight, but she caught it. The deputy hesitated. "Sir, the arrangement is for the children specifically." "I'm aware. I'm also aware that the point of this proceeding is to ensure the children are cared for." He let that sit for a moment. "Their mother is the one who'd care for them. Seems to me you can't separate the two and call it a solution." The deputy looked at his papers, looked at the magistrate who had appeared on the steps. Poole's expression was unreadable. "The court has an authorized—" Poole began. "What's the authorized amount?" the man said. He wasn't arguing, he was just asking in the flat way of someone who expects a number. Poole told him. The man reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope that he'd clearly prepared in advance. He held it up. "I'll double it. For all 6 children and their mother as a unit. They go together, or the deal doesn't happen." Silence in the cold street. "Who are you?" Garland's lawyer said. The man looked at him. "Cole Mercer. I run a ranch up in the Boulder Valley." "I've never heard of you." "That doesn't change what's in the envelope," Cole said. The crowd sorted itself into 2 reactions, fascination and disapproval. Evelyn could hear both from where she stood. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. A man from outside town arriving to spend money no one had expected, disrupting an outcome that had been, if not openly acknowledged, generally anticipated. People looked at Garland. Garland's face had gone very still. Poole was caught between several things, and Evelyn watched him work through them. The court's arrangement was technically about the children. It did not explicitly include or exclude her. The man, Mercer, had made a legal offer above the requested amount. Blocking it without cause would be difficult to justify in writing, which the territorial office letter from Abbott had made them all aware of. "Mr. Mercer," Poole said finally, "you understand this arrangement would require you to provide for the children until—" "I understand what I'm agreeing to," Cole said. "Do you have a counteroffer?" No one did. The money was counted. The paperwork, such as it was signed. Evelyn signed her name where they told her to sign, next to Cole Mercer's, with hands that were cold enough that her signature came out shaky. She wasn't sure what she was signing, not fully. She wasn't sure what any of this meant. She was sure that her children were still with her. All of them. Clara still on her hip, Margaret's hand still in hers, Daniel standing at her left side, Henry at her right, Josiah pressed against the back of her legs, Ruth holding Josiah's hand. 6 children. All present. She could figure out the rest. When the signing was done, Cole Mercer looked at her for the first time since the whole thing started. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Patient gray eyes, with lines at the corners. "I've got a wagon around the corner," he said. "We should get moving before dark. It's a 3-hour drive." "Where are we going?" she asked. "My ranch. I've got room." He paused. "You can decide what to do from there." She looked at him for a long moment, trying to read him, trying to find the thing underneath, the motive, the angle she wasn't seeing. She'd grown up learning that when men did things, there was always something they wanted in return, and the question was whether the price was one you could afford. She couldn't find it. Not in 3 seconds of looking at a stranger's face in the middle of a frozen street while her children leaned against her. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe she wasn't thinking straight. Maybe there wasn't anything to find. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Yes." "If you're expecting anything from this arrangement beyond what's written on those papers—" "I'm not," he said. Simple. Not defensive. Not performed. "My ranch is large enough for a family. It's been quiet for a long time, that's all." She looked at him another moment. Then she looked at her children. Clara had fallen asleep against her shoulder, which was both a relief and a small heartbreak. Daniel was watching Cole with the flat assessment of a boy trying to calculate whether this man could be trusted. Henry's fists were still slightly balled at his sides. "All right," she said. "Show us the wagon." He turned without drama and started walking. She followed him, and her children followed her, through the cold streets of Caldwell Creek, while what remained of the crowd watched, and Garland Hartwell watched, and the gray sky offered no opinion on any of it. Behind her, she did not look back at the county building, or the deputy, or the magistrate, or the man who had taken her land and tried to take her children. She looked at the street ahead and the broad back of the stranger who had, for reasons she hadn't yet determined, just bought her family's safety with his own money. She had survived the morning. That was enough to work with. The wagon was a good one, solid, well-maintained, with a canvas cover and enough blankets in the bed for the children to pile into together. Cole helped the little ones in without ceremony, held Clara while Evelyn climbed up, then handed Clara back without a word. Daniel took the seat beside him on the bench. Evelyn noted that and said nothing. They left Caldwell Creek as the morning was still young, heading north along the river road while the town fell behind them. The children were quiet. Even Henry was quiet, which Evelyn figured was the cold more than anything. Ruth had taken charge of Josiah in the wagon bed, the way she always did. Margaret sat beside Evelyn with her eyes on the road. "Are we safe?" Margaret asked very quietly. Evelyn considered the question. Considered the man holding the reins next to her daughter. Considered what she knew, which was almost nothing, and what she had, which was her children and her wits, and $260 sewn into her coat lining. "For right now," she said. Yes. It wasn't everything, but it was honest, and in the moment, honest was what she had. The wagon moved north through the frozen valley, away from town, away from the auction and the magistrate and Garland's careful, patient face, and Evelyn Hartwell sat upright in the cold and watched the mountains come nearer and told herself that surviving the first part was what let you get to the next one. She had survived. She was still here. Her children were still beside her. For now, that had to be enough. The road north out of Caldwell Creek followed the river for the first hour, then climbed. The valley floor dropped away behind them, replaced by rising terrain and timber, and the kind of silence that only existed this far from town. A silence with texture to it, weighted by snow and distance and the particular absence of human noise. The children had gone quiet in the wagon bed not long after they left, and Evelyn didn't know whether they were sleeping or simply too overwhelmed to speak. Either way, she let them be. Cole Mercer drove this way he did most things. She was already learning, without excess. His hands on the reins were steady but not rigid, responding to the road shifts with the casual competence of a man who had driven this particular route enough times that his body knew it without his mind having to engage. He didn't try to fill the silence with conversation. He didn't offer reassurances or explanations. He simply drove. Daniel sat between them on the bench, which Evelyn understood was not an accident. Her son had positioned himself there deliberately, and she loved him for it and worried about him for it in equal measure. He was 15 years old and had decided somewhere in the past 6 weeks that he was the man of the family now. She hadn't corrected him because she needed him and because there hadn't been time, but looking at the set of his jaw and the careful way he watched Cole from the corner of his eye, she thought that particular decision was going to cost him something before long. "How far is it?" Daniel asked. His voice came out steadier than she expected. 3 hours, give or take, Cole said. "Depends on how the road's holding. There was drifting yesterday near the upper pass. What's the ranch called?" Cole glanced at him briefly. "Mercer Ranch. I haven't gotten around to something more poetic." Daniel was quiet a moment, processing whether that was a joke. Evelyn thought it probably wasn't. "How many acres?" "About 310. "What do you run?" "Cattle, mostly. Some horses. Keep chickens for eggs." Cole shifted the reins to one hand briefly and pulled his coat tighter with the other. "I'll need help come spring, if you're offering to work." Daniel looked at him. "I wasn't offering anything." "I know you weren't," Cole said. "I was just noting it, in case you were thinking ahead." Daniel turned and looked at the road. Evelyn watched her son's profile and saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. The thing he did when he was trying to decide whether to push harder or pull back. He pulled back. That was Thomas in him. Thomas always knew when to hold. She didn't say anything. The wagon moved on up the road through the snow and the pines, and the mountain got bigger ahead of them, and eventually Clara stirred in the wagon bed and called out for her mother in a sleepy voice, and Evelyn climbed back over the bench to sit with her youngest. And the motion of Cole's driving and the blankets piled around them did what they always did with small children, and Clara was asleep again in minutes. Evelyn sat in the wagon bed with Clara's head in her lap, and the cold coming up through the boards despite the blankets, and she looked at the sky between the pine branches and tried to think straight. She was not frightened. Or rather, she was frightened, but fear had become such a constant companion in the past 6 weeks that it had started to feel less like an alarm and more like weather, a condition to be dressed for. What she didn't know about Cole Mercer was considerable. What she did know was narrow and specific. He had money, he had land, he had arrived at the auction with a prepared envelope and a plan, and he had not asked anything of her yet. That last part was the one she kept returning to. In her experience, men who did things without asking first were either extraordinarily decent or waiting for a moment when the asking would carry more weight. She had no way, from the wagon bed of his vehicle on the 3rd hour of knowing him, to determine which this was. She would have to watch. She was good at watching. The ranch came into view around the last bend of the upper road, and despite herself, Evelyn felt something loosen slightly in her chest at the sight of it. It was not a showpiece. She wanted to be clear about that to herself, because she didn't want to let an aesthetic reaction cloud her judgment. The main house was large, larger than she'd expected, 2 stories with a wide porch across the front and windows that showed light inside even at this hour. But it had the look of a place built in stages, one addition after another over many years. And the additions didn't always line up with each other at quite the right angles. There was a barn behind the house, well-built and solid, and several outbuildings, and a corral with 4 horses standing in the far corner with their rumps to the wind. The whole property had a quality of functionality without grace that Evelyn recognized. It was the look of a place where someone had been working very hard for a long time, alone. The children had woken up in the last stretch of road and were quiet in the wagon bed, looking at the ranch with various expressions. Ruth was wide-eyed. Josiah was pressed against the side of the wagon trying to see the horses. Clara, still drowsy, had climbed back into Evelyn's arms and was frowning at the house with the particular suspicion of a 4-year-old confronting the unfamiliar. "Is this it?" Henry said. "Yes," Cole said. He pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake and climbed down, and then just stood there a moment looking at his own property, the way people sometimes look at things they've lived with so long, they've stopped seeing them. Whatever he saw in that moment, he kept to himself. "Come on in," he said. "There's heat inside, and I can make something to eat." Ishtik. The house was warm. Whatever else was uncertain, that was real and immediate. Warmth radiating from a big iron stove in the kitchen and a fireplace in the front room that had been banked low and caught quickly when Cole added a log. The children responded to the warmth the way cold animals do, spreading out toward it without thinking about it, and Evelyn watched them shed a little of the day's tension and felt something that was not quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. The kitchen was the largest room on the ground floor. It was not a tidy kitchen. There were signs everywhere of a person who cooked practically and cleaned when it became necessary. But it was equipped well, with a proper range and good pots and a table large enough, barely, for all 8 of them. The shelves were stocked. Evelyn's eyes went to the shelves automatically, and she noted flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods, coffee. Not a pantry arranged for show. A pantry arranged by someone who understood winter provisions. Cole made coffee without asking if they wanted it, and put milk to heat for the children and started cutting salt pork for the pan while the stove came up to temperature, and he moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had been feeding himself for years and had no particular anxiety about it. He didn't talk while he cooked. He didn't perform helpfulness. He just made food. Evelyn stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room and watched him and said nothing. Margaret appeared at her elbow. "He lives here alone?" she murmured. "It looks like it." "Why's the table this big then?" Evelyn didn't answer that. It was a good question, and she'd already noticed it herself. The table was built for a larger family than one man. The chairs were mismatched, 4 of them, but there were also 2 benches along the wall that had been pulled out at some point. Someone had expected, or hoped for, company. She filed that away. Mikam. Dinner was plain and hot and plentiful, which was exactly what 8 people in the aftermath of a terrible day needed. The children ate with the focused intensity of the genuinely hungry, and the warmth in the food did what they always do. And by the time the plates were cleared, Josiah was half asleep, leaning against Ruth's shoulder, and Clara had been carried to a chair by the fire and was making the small determined sounds of a child fighting sleep. Cole had shown them the upstairs before dinner, 3 rooms, 2 of which were empty and unfurnished beyond a bed frame in each. He'd brought blankets from a cedar chest without commentary and left them to arrange what they needed. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't meant to be. It was dry and warm, and the roof was solid and the windows were tight. And for the Hartwell children who had spent 11 days in a 2-room hotel, it was more than adequate. When the younger children were settled upstairs, Evelyn came back down to find Cole at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a ledger book, though he closed it when she came in. Daniel was still there, which didn't surprise her. Her son had clearly decided that wherever Cole Mercer was, he would be nearby. She poured herself coffee and sat down at the table. It was the first time since the auction that she'd sat down without a child in her arms or at her side. And the feeling was strange, a kind of lightness and a kind of emptiness together. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I think we need to talk about the arrangement." He looked up from his coffee. "All right. You paid a significant amount of money today. I'd like to know what you expect in return." He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "Nothing legally binding," he said. "What I paid today was what it cost to keep your family together. I wasn't buying anything. Men don't spend money like that without wanting something. Some do." "In my experience," she started. "Your experience has been limited to people who wanted something," he said. Not harshly, flatly. "That's understandable, given what you've been through. But it's not everyone." Daniel was watching Cole with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and wasn't quite succeeding. "Why did you do it then?" he said. Cole looked at him. "I heard about the auction. I've heard about your family's situation." "From who?" "People talk. I come into Caldwell Creek every few weeks for supplies." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "What was happening was wrong. I was in a position to do something about it, so I did." "That's it?" Daniel said. He made it sound like an accusation. "That's it." "That's not how people work." Cole looked at him steadily. "How old are you?" 15? "You've been watching people do bad things for 6 weeks, and you've decided that's how people work," Cole said. "That's understandable, but it's not the conclusion I'd want you to stick with." Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at his mother, then back at Cole. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't leave either. Evelyn set her cup down. "I appreciate what you did today. I genuinely do. But I need you to understand that I'm not going to simply trust you because you did it. I have 6 children, and I can't afford to be wrong about who's safe." "That's sensible," Cole said. "I'll work. Whatever needs doing on this ranch, I can do it, and the older children can help with what's appropriate for their ages. I'm not here to be kept." "I didn't think you were." "I'll need to find a way to pay you back." He shook his head. "It's not negotiable," she said. "I need to be clear about the terms. What I owe you, I'll pay. What the children owe you, we'll work off. This is not charity. Is that acceptable?" He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she couldn't read. Not irritation, not amusement, something quieter. "It's acceptable," he said. "Good." She picked up her cup. "Then we have an arrangement." Okay. The first week was strange in the way all necessary adjacency with strangers is strange. 8 people occupying a space that had held one for what appeared to be a long time, learning each other's habits by collision and observation. Cole woke before dawn every morning, which Evelyn discovered because she also woke before dawn. She always had. It was simply her nature. And on the second morning, she came downstairs to find him already at the stove making coffee. And they'd looked at each other with mutual surprise and then settled into a breakfast routine that neither of them discussed, but both maintained. He was quiet in the morning. She was quiet in the morning. It worked. The children organized themselves around the ranch with varying degrees of willingness. Daniel was out at the barn by 7 every morning, which Evelyn suspected had less to do with enthusiasm and more to do with keeping an eye on Cole. Henry was slower to warm, dragging his feet for the first few days before some combination of boredom and the horses in the corral wore him down. The horses were the thing that broke Henry. Specifically, a bad-tempered bay gelding named Wick that Cole had mentioned no one had managed to gentle properly. Henry had been watching the horse from the fence for 3 days before Cole said, without looking up from the fence post he was repairing, "You can try if you want." Henry had been in that corral every day since. The horse was still bad-tempered. Henry didn't seem to mind. Margaret took over the cooking with Evelyn and asked such direct, practical questions about where things were kept and how Cole preferred things done that he'd seemed briefly taken aback by her, then answered her questions with matching directness. Ruth took responsibility for the younger children with the steady competence of a 9-year-old who had been stepping into that role for years. Josiah was simply delighted by everything. The barn cats, the horses, the enormous breakfast Cole produced on the 3rd morning, the geography of a house with 2 sets of stairs. Clara watched Cole from a distance for 4 days. She was 4, and 4-year-olds had their own systems for evaluating safety, and Evelyn had learned not to rush Clara's systems. On the 5th evening, Clara walked up to Cole while he was sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, placed her hand on his knee, looked up at him with the frank evaluation only small children can get away with, and said, "You have a sad face." Cole looked down at her. A long moment passed. "Do I?" he said. Clara considered this. Papa had a sad face sometimes, when he thought we weren't looking. "Clara," Evelyn started. "It's fine," Cole said quietly. He looked at Clara for another moment. "Maybe I do." Clara nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and wandered off to find her doll. Cole sat very still at the table, looking at the place she'd been standing, and Evelyn looked at him and saw something in his face that she hadn't been able to name before and suddenly could. The particular grief of a person who has not been spoken to gently in a long time. She didn't say anything about it, but she didn't look away as fast as she otherwise would have. The trust, such as it was, and what little of it there had been, began to build in the way trust actually builds. Not in grand gestures or honest declarations, but in the accumulation of small things that hold. A door repaired without being asked. A cough noticed and remedied with the right herbs from the shelf. The way Cole positioned himself between the wind and the smaller children when they crossed the yard without seeming to think about it. The way he spoke to Daniel like a person who deserved a real answer rather than a placated one. There were still tensions. Henry took longer than the others, cycling between grudging cooperation and outright hostility. On the 9th day, he told Cole at breakfast that he didn't know why they were all pretending this was their home, because it wasn't. The table had gone very quiet. Cole had looked at Henry for a moment and said, "You're right, it isn't, but it's where you are, and there's nothing wrong with making the best of where you are while you figure out what comes next." Henry had said nothing. He'd also stayed at the table and finished his breakfast, which Evelyn counted as progress. She and Cole fell into a rhythm of evening conversation that neither of them had planned. After the children were in bed and the kitchen was cleaned, there was a natural period where the house settled and the fire burned low, and they were both people who sat up late. They talked about practical things at first: the ranch, the winter ahead, what work needed doing, what the children could handle. Cole was straightforward and specific and didn't waste words, which she appreciated because she was the same way. She asked about the ranch's finances without embarrassment, and he told her without apparent discomfort, which she found surprising and then found she respected. It was on the 12th evening that she finally asked the question she'd been carrying. "The table in the kitchen," she said. "It was built for more people." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Yes." "Did you have a family?" A long pause. The fire shifted. "I did." She waited. She was good at waiting. "Wife. 2 sons." He turned his cup in his hands, looking at it. 8 years ago. Sickness came through the valley that winter. It moved fast. He stopped, started again. "I was up at the north pasture when it started. By the time I got back," he didn't finish that sentence. "It was 3 days, start to finish. The doctor from the nearest town was 3 hours away, and there was a blizzard, and he didn't make it in time." The fire was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. She meant it the way you mean something when words feel completely inadequate but are all you have. "It was 8 years ago," he said. which meant, she understood, both that it was in the past and that it was not in the past. Those two things could be true simultaneously. "You kept the ranch," she said. "I didn't know what else to do." He looked at the fire. "The ranch needed doing. It kept me occupied. After a while, it was just," he gestured vaguely, "what I was." She thought about that. Thought about a man alone in a house with a large table and 2 empty upstairs rooms for 8 years. "When you came to that auction," she said carefully, "was part of it, maybe," he said, before she could finish. He looked at her then, directly, the gray eyes steady. "I'm not pretending it was purely selfless. I've been alone a long time and the ranch is too much for one person, and I was—" He stopped. "I was ready for things to be different. But that's not the same as wanting anything from you, Mrs. Hartwell. What you said the first night about the terms. That was right. That's what this is." She held that for a moment. It was an honest answer. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months, maybe. She had gotten so accustomed to people saying things that were only the surface of other things. "All right," she said. "All right? I believe you." She picked up her cup. "That doesn't mean I'm not still watching." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I wouldn't expect anything different." Quote. She was in the barn with Margaret on the 15th day. They'd been helping with the horses, or rather Margaret had been helping while Evelyn tried to remember what she knew about horsemanship and found it coming back in fragments. When Daniel appeared in the barn door with his face arranged in the particular way he arranged it, when he had news he hadn't decided how to deliver. "What is it?" Evelyn said immediately. "There's a man at the house," Daniel said. "Came up the road about 10 minutes ago. He's got papers." She was out of the barn before he finished. Daniel fell into step beside her and Margaret came after, and by the time they reached the porch, Cole was already there, standing at the top of the steps with his arms at his sides while a man in a clerk's coat stood at the bottom with an envelope in his hand. She recognized the clerk. His name was Finch, and he worked for the magistrate's office. "Mrs. Hartwell," Finch said when he saw her. He had the look of a man doing a job he didn't enjoy. "Mr. Finch." She stopped at Cole's side. "What is this?" He held out the envelope. She took it and opened it and read it while everyone waited. It was worse than she expected, and she had expected something bad. The document was from the county court, from Magistrate Poole, and it stated that the prior arrangement regarding the Hartwell children, specifically the terms under which they had been placed, was under review. The review had been initiated at the request of a petitioner. The petitioner's name was Garland Hartwell. The document further stated that Garland had filed a separate challenge, asserting that Cole Mercer had no legitimate legal claim to assume care of the children and had potentially circumvented the proper process at the auction. It requested that Evelyn and the children present themselves in Caldwell Creek within the week for a formal review. There was a second page. She almost didn't read it. The first had already closed something cold in her chest. But she read it. It stated that pending the review, Garland Hartwell was asserting custodial rights over the children as the surviving male heir of the family and was formally requesting that the court enforce those rights. She stood on the porch and read the document twice. The cold came up through her boots and the wind pulled at the paper in her hands. "Mrs. Hartwell," Finch said, "I'm just the delivery us." "I know," she said. "Thank you for coming all this way." He nodded and went back to his horse and rode down the road. She stood holding the papers. Cole said, "How bad?" She handed him the document without speaking. He read it. His expression didn't change, but she'd learned in 2 weeks that his expressions rarely did. Daniel had moved up beside her. She could feel him reading the paper over Cole's arm. She watched his face and saw the moment he understood what it said, and watched the careful thing he'd built over 2 weeks. The cautious stability, the managed anxiety, crack along an invisible line. "He's doing it again," Daniel said. His voice was very flat. "He's just going to keep doing it." "Yes," Evelyn said. "So what do we do?" She looked at Cole. Cole looked at her. Neither of them had an answer yet. Not a real one, not the kind that counted. What she had was a document and a week's deadline, and a man standing beside her who had 8 days ago been a stranger. "We think," she said, "and then we decide." Daniel made a sound that was not quite a word. He went inside. She heard his feet on the stairs and then the sound of a door closing. Not slammed, just closed, which in some ways was worse. Margaret was standing in the barn door behind them, far enough away to give them space, but close enough to see everything. Evelyn looked at her daughter and gave her the small nod that meant, "I know, and it's not over," and go back inside. Margaret gave her a look in return that was her father's look, the one that said, "I will if you need me to, but I'm here," and went. Evelyn turned back to the porch railing and the road and the gray sky over the mountains. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly. "No," Cole said. He was still holding the papers. "The court is his. The magistrate is his. If we go back to Caldwell Creek for a formal review, I know." "So what does that leave?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say, but the quiet of someone working through something carefully. The wind moved through the cottonwoods at the edge of the yard, and they stood in it without moving. "There's something I've been thinking about," Cole said finally. She looked at him. "Tell me. Your husband's lockbox. The documents Garland took. What about them? If those documents exist, the real deed, the real will, Garland has them somewhere. You don't destroy evidence like that. You keep it because you might need to use it later, or because the kind of man who steals things doesn't throw anything away." She understood where he was going, slowly, and the feeling that came with it was complicated, something between hope and a kind of sick fear. "The ranch house," she said. "He's been there 6 weeks. He's had time to settle. His papers would be somewhere on that property." He paused. "It would be risky." "Yes." "Getting caught would make things significantly worse." "Yes." He looked at her. "I wasn't suggesting it." "I know." She looked back at him. "I am." The silence stretched between them. Above the mountains, the sky was doing what it did all winter, turning colors that were beautiful and cold at the same time, indifferent and spectacular. Evelyn watched it and thought about Thomas, and thought about 6 children upstairs, and thought about a man she'd known for 2 weeks who had told her the worst thing that had ever happened to him because she'd asked a direct question and he was an honest person. "I'll need to know the property," she said, "the layout of the house, where he'd most likely keep documents. You'd know that better than I would." "Yes." She straightened. "I'll think it through." She took the papers back from him and folded them precisely and put them in her coat pocket. Then she went inside to find Daniel. He needed to know that the crack in the wall wasn't the end of the wall, and she was the only one who could tell him that, and she was going to have to believe it herself first, which she was almost certain she could manage. She climbed the stairs. The house creaked under her feet in the way old houses do, not threateningly, just acknowledging her weight, her presence, the fact that she was here and moving through it. Below, she heard Cole come in from the cold. She heard him put another log on the fire. She knocked on Daniel's door. "It's me," she said. A pause, then, "Come in." She went in. The plan took 3 days to build and had holes in it that neither of them could fully close. Evelyn laid it out on the kitchen table the evening after Finch's visit, once the younger children were in bed, and Daniel had come back downstairs with the red-rimmed eyes of a boy who had allowed himself to feel something in private and was now done with it. She'd drawn the ranch from memory on the back of an old supply list. The house, the outbuildings, the fence lines, the approach road, and the dry creek bed that ran along the property's western edge. Her memory of the place was specific in the way that 18 years of living somewhere makes things specific. She knew which floorboard squeaked at the top of the stairs. She knew the bedroom window latch was broken on the left side. She knew Thomas had kept the lockbox under the bed, and she knew where Garland, who was his brother and had grown up in the same family with the same habits, would most likely store papers he considered important. Cole had listened to all of it without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was his particular method of paying attention. "The study," he said when she finished. "The study," she confirmed. It was a small room off the main hall that Thomas had used for accounts and correspondence. A roll-top desk, a filing cabinet, a shelf of ledgers. If Garland had settled into the house the way she believed he had, assuming ownership, performing the role, he would have taken that room as his own. The papers would be there. "How do we get in without being seen?" "The west side of this house has no windows on the ground floor. There's a door into the laundry room that's never locked properly. The frame warped years ago, and the bolt doesn't sit right. Thomas always meant to fix it and never did." She looked at the drawing. If we come in along the creek bed, we stay off the road entirely. There's a stand of willows along the south bank that gives cover to within 50 yards of the house. What about the hands? Garland brought 2 men with him when he came to clear us out. I don't know if he's hired more since. She paused. The bunkhouse is on the east side. If we come from the west, we shouldn't cross their path, assuming they stay where they're supposed to. Assuming, Daniel said. He was sitting at the end of the table with his arms folded, not quite part of the conversation and not quite separate from it. Yes, Evelyn said, assuming. I want to come. No. Mama. Daniel. She looked at him directly. If something goes wrong, someone needs to be here with the children. Someone they trust. That's you. She held his gaze until he looked down. That's not a small thing. That's the most important thing. He didn't agree, not aloud, but he didn't argue further. Cole said, when? She thought about it. The document gave them a week. The formal review was in 5 days now. If they went too soon and were caught, there would be no time to do anything with what they found. If they went too late and were caught, there would be no point. Thursday night, she said. It gives us 2 days to prepare and 2 days to get to an attorney with what we find before the review. That's tight. Yes. He looked at the drawing for a moment. We'll need to leave by 10 o'clock, be on the property by midnight, out before 2. I know the house. I can move through it in the dark. He nodded once. The conversation was over in the practical sense, though neither of them moved from the table right away. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, and the kitchen was cooling at the edges, and the nighttime sounds of the ranch had settled into their familiar pattern. The creak of the house contracting in the cold, the distant sound of a horse shifting in the barn. Evelyn looked at her drawing, looked at the lines she'd made from memory representing the place where she'd built her life and lost it, and thought about walking back into it in the dark like a thief. The thought produced something she hadn't expected. Not fear, or not only fear, something harder than fear. Anger, perhaps. Or something that lived close to anger but was more focused. I need you to understand something, she said. Not quite to Cole and not quite to Daniel, but to the room. Both of them looked at her. I'm not doing this to get back what was taken. I mean, I am, but that's not all of it. She looked at the drawing. Thomas spent 18 years building that life. He was careful about every legal thing. He registered everything. He documented everything, because he knew that a man without documentation had nothing that anyone was obligated to honor. Garland knew that too, which is why he took the lockbox. He took the proof because he understood that the proof was the thing. She folded the drawing carefully. What we're going to get Thursday night isn't just our land. It's the record that Thomas existed, that he built something and intended for it to go to his children. I will not let Garland erase that. The kitchen was very quiet. All right, Cole said. Daniel said nothing. He was looking at the table with the expression he got when something had hit him in a place he wasn't prepared for. After a moment, he got up and pushed in his chair and said goodnight in a voice that was slightly unsteady and went upstairs. Evelyn listened to his footsteps and then the quiet after. She looked at Cole. Thank you, she said. For what? For not telling me the risks again. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but something that acknowledged the moment without performing it. He picked up the drawing and looked at it once more and set it down. Get some sleep, he said. Thursday's going to be a long night. Tim. The 2 days between felt both very long and very short, which was the particular quality of time when you were waiting for something that frightened you. Evelyn moved through the ranch's rhythms with deliberate normalcy. Meals and laundry and the mending that had piled up, the ongoing task of making 6 children feel stable in an unstable situation. She was good at that, or had become good at it. Thomas had been sick for 7 months, and she'd spent those months learning the skill of performing steadiness when she didn't feel it, because her children watched her face to understand what was happening, and she couldn't afford to let her face tell them the truth all the time. Cole spent Thursday afternoon in the barn doing something with the horses that gave him a reason to be outside and away from the house. Evelyn noticed he did this, manufactured distance when the walls got too close. And she recognized it because she did the same thing in a different way, retreating into task and motion. She told Margaret on Thursday morning. She had debated not telling her, but Margaret was 13 and had been watching everything with those careful eyes, and would know something was happening regardless. And Evelyn believed her daughter deserved the truth. "How dangerous is it?" Margaret asked. She was standing at the kitchen counter chopping carrots with the focused attention she gave everything, and she didn't stop when she asked. "There's risk," Evelyn said. "If we're caught, it makes things worse. If we're not caught, and we find what I think we'll find, it changes everything." "What if the documents aren't there?" "Then we've still learned something." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You trust him." She didn't say Cole's name. She didn't need to. Evelyn considered the question honestly. "I trust that his interests and mine are aligned right now," she said. "That's not the same thing." "Is it enough?" "It has to be." Margaret nodded and went back to chopping. She was her mother's daughter, right down to the pragmatism. Evelyn watched her for a moment and felt the complicated pride of a woman looking at a child who is stronger than she ought to have needed to become. They left at 10 past 10. The night was clear and cold, the temperature somewhere well below freezing, and the stars were the brilliant, hard stars of winter in high country, the kind that gave actual light when your eyes adjusted. Evelyn had dressed practically. Her heaviest coat, dark wool trousers she'd altered from an old pair of Thomas's, boots with good soles. She'd braided her hair tight. She carried nothing but the clothes she wore and the folding knife Thomas had given her 8 years ago that she'd kept in her coat pocket ever since. Cole had the horses ready and saddled in the dark barn. He handed her the reins of the steadier of the two animals, a dark bay named Rook, that she'd ridden twice in the past 2 weeks and found cooperative. "You're sure about the creek bed approach?" he said quietly. "I've walked it in the dark before. Summer nights, but the geography doesn't change." She mounted. "Stay close and stay off the road once we're within a mile." He nodded. They rode out of the barn without lanterns. Daniel was standing on the porch when they came around the front of the house. Evelyn pulled up for a moment. "Stay inside," she said. "Whatever you hear, whatever time it is, keep the doors locked and don't come out until morning." He looked at her. He looked at Cole. He said, "You'd better come back." "We will," she said. She didn't make it a promise because she wasn't certain she could keep it, and she'd decided years ago not to make promises she couldn't guarantee. But she held his gaze long enough to communicate something she couldn't put into words. And then she turned Rook and rode. Keta. The road south toward Caldwell Creek and the Hartwell property was empty at that hour, which she'd counted on. They rode at a walk for the first half-mile to keep the sound down, then moved to a canter once they were deep enough into the timber that the noise was absorbed. Cole rode on her left, slightly back, and didn't talk. She was grateful for that. She needed to think. The dry creek bed that marked the western boundary of her former property was easy to find even in the dark. The willows were distinctive, and she knew the gap in the fence line from years of walking the perimeter with Thomas during spring mending. She slowed Rook to a walk again as they hit the creek bed's sandy floor, and Cole came up beside her. "Quarter mile," she said quietly. He nodded. She istut. The willow grove was exactly where it always was, which was the particular mercy of knowing a landscape intimately. She tied Rook to a branch and stood still in the cold for a moment, listening. Nothing unusual. The wind through the bare branches. In the distance, the creak of the windmill near the stock tank, which had always needed greasing and Thomas had always meant to fix in spring. They moved through the last 50 yards in the shadow of the fence line, crouched low and moving slowly. The house was dark except for a single lamp in the upper right window. The master bedroom, Thomas's room, which was now presumably Garland's. The bunkhouse on the east side showed no light. The main barn was closed. Evelyn counted the lights and the silence and made a decision. "Now," she said under her breath. They crossed the open yard fast and low, the snow muffling their steps, and reached the west wall of the house. She found the laundry room door by touch as much as sight. The third door along the west side, the one with the slight outward lean that came from the warped frame. She pressed the latch down slowly and pushed and felt the familiar give of a bolt that never quite seated. The door swung open, cold air out, slightly warmer air in. She stepped inside. The laundry room smelled the same, soap and cold water, and the particular damp of a room with no real ventilation. The darkness was absolute here, and she moved from memory, hand along the wall, until she found the interior door that opened to the back hall. She paused there and listened. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that meant sleep rather than the kind that meant waiting, though she'd be testing that assumption with every step. Cole came in behind her and she felt rather than saw him close the laundry door with care. "The study is off the main hall," she breathed. "Left from here. We passed the kitchen and the back parlor." He didn't answer. She understood that as agreement. She moved through the back hall with her hand trailing the wall. The floorboards were the same boards she'd walked for 18 years, and she knew the one that creaked. Third from the kitchen door, left side, and stepped over it without thinking. Cole followed her step by step, which she took as evidence that he was paying very close attention. The study door was closed. She put her hand on the knob and turned it with the slow deliberateness that made the mechanism whisper rather than click, and pushed. The curtains were drawn in the study, which made the darkness even thicker. She stood still and let her eyes adjust. The roll-top desk was where it had always been. The filing cabinet, the shelf. Cole stepped in behind her and closed the door. She went to the desk first. The roll-top was down and she tried to raise it quietly. It stuck briefly, the way it always had at the halfway point. And then it was open and she put her hands on the surface and began to work by touch. The desk was different than it had been. Thomas had kept it organized in a specific way. Accounts left, correspondence center, current documents right. And whoever was using it now had different habits, more chaotic, papers piled without obvious system. She worked through them quickly, holding each one up toward the curtained window to catch what little light came through. Bills. A letter from a bank in Helena. A surveyor's report. Recent, which made her stomach tighten. Garland was already having the land resurveyed. She filed that information and kept looking. The filing cabinet was unlocked, which surprised her, and then didn't. A man this confident in his legal position might not feel the need to lock things. She went through the drawers with her fingers, feeling the tabs on the folders, reading them by touch when she could, and lifting them to what little light there was when she couldn't. Cole had moved to the bookshelf. She heard him working through it, slow, careful, methodical. She was in the third drawer when she found the lockbox. It was sitting behind a row of files near the back of the drawer, which was almost careless, but then perhaps Garland had calculated that the best hiding place was the place that wasn't hidden at all. She recognized it by shape and weight before she could see it. Thomas's lockbox. She'd last seen it under their bed before it vanished. She lifted it out. It was locked. She'd expected that. She set it on the desk and stood there for a moment. A locked box in the dark, 2 hours from dawn, 50 yards from a man who would use it to destroy her family if he caught them here. "Cole," she breathed. He was beside her in 3 steps. She pressed the box into his hands and felt him assess it. Weight, lock type, the thin seam where the lid met the body. "Can you open it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, it'll make noise." "How much?" "Some." She listened to the house. Still quiet. The lamp upstairs was still on. "Do it." She kept her hand on the study door and listened while Cole worked. She could hear what he was doing only barely. A soft scrape of metal, then silence, then another pass at the lock. It took longer than she would have liked. Her heart was doing something unpleasant in her chest, and she was consciously regulating her breathing the way she'd learned to do in the months of Thomas's illness, a skill she would have preferred not to have needed. The lock gave with a click that sounded enormous in the quiet room. She turned. Cole had the box open. He'd moved to the desk and had his head down over the contents, and she crossed to him in 2 steps. The first thing she saw was Thomas's handwriting. The actual deed to the Hartwell property, registered and stamped, with Thomas's real signature at the bottom. The filing date was 18 years ago, 1 month after they'd broken the first ground. She had not seen this document in 6 weeks, and the sight of it made something tear loose in the middle of her chest that she couldn't stop. Some held thing releasing all at once, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and stood there for 3 seconds, not breathing. Then she kept looking. The will was there. Thomas's actual will, handwritten and witnessed, dated 14 months ago. During his illness, when he'd known he was dying and had done what careful men do and put things in order. She scanned it fast in the darkness, enough to confirm what she knew it said. The property and all assets to Evelyn Hartwell, to be held in trust for their children. No provision for Garland, no joint ownership, nothing that resembled the document the magistrate had reviewed. And below the will, folded together, was something she hadn't expected. 2 documents in Garland's handwriting. Drafts, or what appeared to be drafts. The same fraudulent letter of transfer that the court had accepted, in two different versions, the second with corrections marked in the margins. Evidence of composition, evidence of revision. Not a letter Thomas had written and signed, a letter that had been drafted and refined by someone else entirely. Her hands were shaking. She became aware of this and was annoyed by it and held the document steady through main force. "This is it," she said, barely sound. Cole looked at what she was holding. He was quiet for a moment, then, "All of it. Don't leave anything." She was already gathering. She took the deed, the will, both draft versions of the fraudulent letter, and two additional documents she found beneath them. Correspondence between Garland and someone in Helena that referenced the plan in terms oblique enough to require interpretation, but damning enough to be worth having. She folded everything flat and tucked it inside her coat, against her body. "We need to go," Cole said. "Yes." She closed the lockbox and put it back in the drawer where she'd found it, and closed the drawer. She lowered the roll top on the desk. She looked around the study to see if anything was visibly disturbed. In the dark, it was hard to tell. She would have to trust that it was close enough. Cole was already at the study door listening. He turned and gave her a look that she read as clear, and she followed him out into the hall. They made it as far as the kitchen. The lamp appeared from the back stairs, a hand-carried lamp, moving fast, held by a man coming down the stairs in his boots with a coat thrown over his nightclothes. He was not Garland. He was one of Garland's men, the one she recognized as the foreman he'd brought from Helena, a large man named Briggs, who was already looking toward the kitchen before the lamplight fully reached it. He saw them. The moment stretched, Briggs' face going through recognition, confusion, alarm, and decision in rapid sequence. His hand moved toward his hip where there was, she saw now, a holster. "Don't," Cole said. His voice was very flat. Briggs stopped moving but didn't back down. "What in the—" He was processing. Evelyn watched him process. "You're trespassing, both of you." "We're leaving," Cole said. "The hell you are. I need to get—" Briggs started to move toward the back hall, toward the stairs, toward Garland. Cole moved faster than she expected a man his size to move. He was between Briggs and the hallway in 2 steps, and then they were in contact. Not a fight, not quite, more a containment, Cole's hand on Briggs's coat front and Briggs's arm coming up. The lamp swung and nearly went out and steadied. Evelyn didn't stand there watching. She went for the laundry room door, got it open, looked back. Cole had Briggs turned against the wall with one arm twisted up and the lamp on the kitchen floor where it had landed somehow without breaking. "Go," Cole said to her. "Cole, I'm right behind you. Go." She went. Across the yard in the dark, low and fast, back through the 50 yards of open space that felt 10 times longer than it had going the other way, and into the willow cover. She was untying Rook when Cole came through the fence line at a run. He was breathing hard. He had a cut over one eye that she could see, even in the dark, bleeding freely down the side of his face. "Mount up," he said. He was already at his horse. "Are you—" "Mount up, Evelyn." She mounted. They rode. They rode hard for the first mile, staying off the road and cutting north through the timber where the ground was rough, and the branches came close in the dark, and there was every chance of a horse putting a foot wrong. Neither of them spoke. Evelyn kept her head low and her hands steady, and trusted Rook to find footing in the dark the way horses do when they're given the chance. It was only when they'd put 2 solid miles between themselves and the property, and the timber had thinned enough that she could hear nothing behind them, that Cole slowed to a walk and she matched him. She said, "How bad is the cut?" "Not bad." "You're bleeding on your coat." "It'll dry." She rode beside him in the dark and tried to get her heart rate back to something manageable. The documents were still inside her coat, pressed against her body. She could feel the slight stiffness of the folded papers against her ribs. "He'll go to Garland," she said. "Briggs." "Yes. Tonight, probably. They'll know we were there. They'll know someone was there. They won't know what we took until Garland goes to the study." He paused. "If we're lucky, that's not until morning. And if we're not lucky, then we ride faster." She considered the road ahead of them. 3 hours back to Cole's ranch, 2 hours of night left, and then whatever daylight brought. "We can't go to Abbott," she said. He's not strong enough for this. No. The territorial office letter. Garland's lawyer will know about that. He'll know there's been a protest filed. She thought out loud, the way she sometimes did when she needed to hear the problem in the air rather than just in her head. There's a circuit judge. He comes through the region. Thomas mentioned it once. A judge out of the territorial capital who isn't Poole's appointment. His name is Carver, Cole said. I know of him. He was in Billings 2 weeks ago. She turned and looked at him. How do you know that? I asked around. After Finch brought those papers, I asked around. He looked ahead at the road. A man named Carver, appointed directly by the territorial government. He's not Poole's man. He's not anyone's man, particularly. Can we reach him before the review? We'd have to ride tomorrow. Send a rider to Billings tonight, actually, and hope he's still there or has left a forwarding address. He stopped. It's not certain. Nothing about this is certain. No. She looked at the dark road, at the mountains ahead of them, Cole's ranch somewhere up in them, where 6 children were sleeping. Or not sleeping, probably, because Daniel didn't sleep when he was waiting, and Margaret didn't either. They'd be up there in the dark ranch house running through scenarios. Cole, she said. Yes. When we get back. If this doesn't work. She stopped, tried again. If we go to that review and Garland's position holds, if the court sides with him, it won't. But if it does. He was quiet for a moment. Then we find another way. There's always another step. Is there? There's always another step, he said again. And this time the certainty in his voice was not the certainty of someone performing confidence. It was the certainty of a man who had been in places where he couldn't see the next step and had found it anyway, repeatedly, over 8 years of finding ways to keep going when there was no obvious reason to. Whatever happens in that courtroom, Evelyn, I'm not going to let your children be taken from you. I made a decision the day of the auction, and I don't walk back my decisions. She held that for a moment. The cold air, the stars going slightly softer as the night moved toward its latest hour, Rook's steady footfall on the road. You should have that cut looked at, she said. You can look at it when we're home. She registered the word without comment. Home. He'd said it without apparent awareness that he'd said it, which told her something about where his mind was at this hour of the night, exhausted and bleeding slightly from a cut over his eye after riding through darkness to help her steal evidence from a man who was trying to erase her family. She looked at him, the line of his profile in the dark, the steady way he held himself even now. She turned back to the road. She would look at the cut when they got back. She would look at everything with fresh eyes in the morning. Right now there was just the road and the cold and the documents pressed against her ribs. Thomas's handwriting, Thomas's intentions, the record of a life that no one was going to be allowed to pretend hadn't happened. She rode. The miles passed. The night held. Somewhere up ahead, past the dark bulk of the mountains, the first gray thinking of dawn was beginning to suggest itself at the eastern edge of the sky, and by the time they came down the last road into the yard of Cole's ranch, the darkness had shifted from black to the dark blue that comes just before first light. Daniel was standing on the porch. She'd known he would be. She dismounted before the horse fully stopped and walked to him. He was still in his clothes from the previous day, and he'd been out here in the cold for probably an hour. And he looked at her face, and then at Cole, coming around with the horses, and then at her face again. "Did you get it?" he said. She pulled her coat open and showed him the papers pressed against her side. He looked at them. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, relief and grief and the kind of anger that doesn't have a clean target. And then he pulled himself together with the effort she could actually see, the same effort she made 30 times a day. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." They went inside. The fire was still going. Someone, Margaret, she suspected, had kept it up through the night. The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and the pine boards and the breakfast Margaret had apparently already started, because there was coffee hot on the stove and biscuit dough on the counter, and her 13-year-old daughter appeared from the back of the house with flour on her hands and looked at the cut over Cole's eye and said, without missing a beat, "Sit down. I'll get the iodine." Cole sat. Evelyn set the documents on the kitchen table, smoothed them flat, and looked at them in the lamplight. Really looked at them, for the first time since she'd found them in the dark. Thomas's deed. Thomas's will. Garland's own handwriting caught in the act of constructing a lie. She put her hand on them, just for a moment, just to feel the paper under her palm. Then she straightened and turned to Cole and said, "We need a rider to Billings by first light." He was sitting still while Margaret worked on his cut with the practical lack of ceremony that characterized everything Margaret did. He winced once, the iodine, and then was still again. "I know someone who'll ride," he said. "Hector Finley's boy. He's fast and he's discreet. Can you reach him before dawn?" "I'll go myself." Margaret looked up from his forehead. "You're not going anywhere until I'm done with this." Cole looked at her. Evelyn watched her 13-year-old daughter hold a man's gaze without flinching. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Something released in Evelyn's chest. Not everything. There was still too much ahead for everything to release. But something. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table across from the documents and her daughter and this man who had said the word home without knowing he'd said it. And she let herself sit for a moment and feel the weight of what they'd done and what it might mean and what still remained to be faced. The dawn was coming. The review was in 2 days. Somewhere in Caldwell Creek, a man named Garland Hartwell was either asleep or waking to discover that the papers he'd stolen were no longer quite as safe as he'd believed. She was not done. She was nowhere close to done. But she had what she'd come for, and she was still here, and her children were in the next room, and the next step, however uncertain, was visible. That was enough to work with. Young Cale Finley rode out before sunup with the documents copied in Evelyn's hand, and a letter addressed to Judge Carver, and they didn't hear back until the following afternoon. The wait was its own particular kind of suffering. Evelyn had experienced waiting before. The months of Thomas's illness had been an education in it. But this was different. This had a deadline attached, the way a rope has a far end, and she could feel the clock in everything she did. She fed the children breakfast and kept her face steady. She helped Cole repair a section of fence on the north pasture because standing still was worse than moving. She went over the original documents 3 more times, sitting at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, making sure she understood every word, every date, every implication, so that when she stood in front of whoever was going to hear this, she would not be caught uncertain about anything she was presenting. Cole had sent word to Abbott as well, not to argue the case, because Abbott had already demonstrated the limits of his nerve, but because they needed someone who knew procedure, who could stand in a courtroom and say the right words in the right order. Abbott arrived at the ranch that evening looking like a man who hadn't slept well in days, which Evelyn suspected was accurate. He sat at the kitchen table and went through the documents one by one with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at and was trying to control his reaction to it. When he finished, he set them down and looked at Evelyn. "These are genuine," he said. "Yes." "The will is dated 14 months ago, witnessed by—" He squinted at the signatures. "I recognize one of these names, Ira Callum. He runs the feed store on the north end of Caldwell Creek." "I know Ira," Evelyn said. "He was a friend of Thomas's." "Has he been contacted? Has anyone spoken to him about what he witnessed?" "Not that I know of." Abbott was quiet for a moment, thinking. If Callum will testify, and if these draft documents can be authenticated as Garland's handwriting, and if we can get this in front of a judge who isn't Poole— He stopped. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have to be honest with you. The strength of this evidence depends entirely on who's reading it. In front of Poole, it gets dismissed or delayed. In front of someone independent— Judge Carver," Cole said from across the table. Abbott looked at him. "Carver's out of the Capitol. He doesn't typically ride this territory." "He's in Billings. We sent a rider." Abbott processed this. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite hope, but the beginning of something that could become hope if the conditions were right. "If Carver comes—" He stopped himself. "He might not come. A circuit judge doesn't just ride out because someone sends a letter." "No," Evelyn said. "But the letter described the situation specifically. The territorial office protest, the evidence of fraud, the falsified documents submitted to a county court." She looked at Abbott steadily. "If Carver is the kind of judge his reputation suggests, that's exactly the kind of thing he'd want to see handled correctly." Abbott picked up the draft documents again and looked at them. "These are damning," he said quietly, "if they're authenticated. They're in Garland's hand. I've read his handwriting for 11 years. She paused. "And there's a man in Helena who received correspondence from Garland about this plan. The letters I found at the house reference it obliquely. If that man can be reached, that's a great deal of if, Abbott said. Yes, she said. Welcome to my last 2 months. He had the decency to look slightly ashamed. He gathered the documents carefully and put them in the leather satchel he'd brought. I'll go see Callum tonight, he said. If he'll talk to me, and if he'll testify, that's our strongest direct witness. He stood up, then hesitated. For what it's worth, Mrs. Hartwell, I should have moved faster when you first came to me. I'm sorry for that. She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that. Just do it right now, she said. That's what matters. He went. The evening settled over the ranch, and Evelyn sat with her children at the big kitchen table and let them talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. Josiah's ongoing project of naming all the barn cats, Ruth's discovery that one of the mares was going to foal in spring, Henry's progress with the bay gelding Wick, which had moved from tolerating his presence to actively seeking it. She listened to all of it and asked questions and kept her hands around her coffee cup and let the ordinary life of the ranch exist around her without trying to manage it. Clara climbed into her lap at some point and fell asleep there, and Evelyn sat with her daughter's weight against her chest and looked across the table at the empty place where the documents had been and thought about Thomas. She thought about him differently than she had in the weeks immediately after his death, when thinking about him had been mostly unbearable. Now it was more like a conversation she was still having with someone who wasn't in the room. She thought about what he would say if he could see this, the ranch they'd lost, the road they'd traveled, the man who had met them at an auction in the snow for reasons that still didn't entirely fit any category she'd been taught to trust. She thought Thomas would have taken the measure of Cole Mercer for a long time and then, quietly, approved. She thought he would have approved of her too. That was harder to hold. She wasn't sure she had earned it yet. Cale Finley came back the next morning with a response. Judge Carver would be in Caldwell Creek by Friday. He'd received the letter, reviewed the enclosed copies, and was exercising his authority to attend the scheduled review and expand its scope as the evidence warranted. He'd also sent a separate communication to Magistrate Poole, a communication whose contents Cale didn't know, but whose effect was apparently immediate. Poole had sent a rider to Cole's ranch late Thursday afternoon with a terse message stating that Friday's review had been rescheduled to include an additional presiding authority and that all parties were expected to attend. Cole handed Evelyn that message and watched her read it. He's rattled, she said. Poole. Yes. He wouldn't have sent this if he wasn't. She set the paper down. What about Garland? Abbott says Callum agreed to testify. Came around fast once Abbott showed him the draft documents. Cole paused. Abbott also got a name from one of the letters, the man in Helena. He sent a telegram last night. No response yet. She absorbed this. It may not matter. If Callum testifies and the drafts are authenticated and the real will and deed are before a real judge, it should be enough. Should be, she said. Yes. He didn't dress it up. She appreciated that. They were in the barn. She'd been helping him with the morning feeding, which had become a routine neither of them had formalized but both maintained. The smell of hay and cold and horses was familiar to her in a way that had nothing to do with this barn specifically. It was the smell of every morning of her adult life, and being surrounded by it in a different place with different horses felt like finding a word in a foreign language that meant the same thing. Cole, she said. He was forking hay into the near stall, and he stopped and looked at her. If this goes wrong tomorrow, she stopped. She'd started this sentence before, or something like it, and hadn't gotten where she meant to go. I need to say this once, and then I won't say it again. If Carver doesn't hold, if the evidence isn't enough, if Garland has gotten to someone I haven't accounted for, she looked at him directly. Whatever happens, you have done more for my family than anyone had any obligation to do, more than I had any right to ask. And I'm not good at saying things like that, so I'm saying it now while I'm sure I have the chance. He was looking at her with the steady gray eyes. He didn't deflect it, and he didn't make it smaller. I know, he said. You don't have to. I do, she said. I specifically do, because if tomorrow goes badly, I'm going to be in survival mode again, and I won't have room for it. So, she held his gaze. Thank you. He was quiet for a moment, then, whatever happens tomorrow, Evelyn, this, he gestured, not at the barn, at something larger. This is working, whatever you want to call it. He went back to forking hay. That's all I wanted to say about it." She stood there for a moment. Then she picked up the second fork and kept working. They rode into Caldwell Creek on Friday morning, all 8 of them. It was Evelyn's decision to bring the children. Cole had questioned it, gently, and Abbott had questioned it less gently, and she had listened to both of them and then said, "No, they're coming." She had her reasons, which she didn't fully articulate, but which had something to do with the fact that these children were the central fact of everything Garland had done, everything she had done. And she was not going to resolve the question of their future while they waited at a ranch 3 hours away. Whatever happened in that courtroom, they would be present for it. Daniel had made no comment. He'd simply gone to the barn and saddled his horse without being asked. The town looked different in the morning light than it had on the day of the auction. It was the same town, same buildings, same street, same cold. But the quality of Evelyn's relationship to it had shifted. She had left Caldwell Creek in a stranger's wagon with her children and her $260 in a kind of stunned desperation, and she was returning with evidence of a crime and a federal circuit judge already inside the county building, and her son riding at her left side with his father's jaw set exactly like his father used to set it. She noticed people watching from the sidewalks. Word traveled fast in a small town, and the word had clearly traveled. Some faces she recognized, some she didn't. Mrs. Copeland, who had let her park the wagon behind the dry goods store, lifted a hand from the doorway of her shop. Evelyn nodded back. Garland was standing outside the county building when they arrived. He was with his lawyer and Briggs, who had a swollen jaw that told Evelyn something about what had happened after she and Cole left the ranch the other night. Garland watched them come down the street, and his face was arranged in the careful neutrality that she now understood was his working expression, the face he wore when he was calculating. He looked at the children. He looked at Cole. He looked at Evelyn. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She dismounted and tied her horse and walked past him into the county building with her children behind her. The hearing room had been rearranged. Poole's usual position at the center had been shifted, and a second chair had been added at the main table. Judge Carver was already seated, a lean man in his late 50s with a carefully trimmed beard and the kind of posture that comes from years of courtroom authority. He had papers in front of him, and he was reading when they came in, and he looked up once, assessed the room with experienced eyes, and went back to reading. Abbott was at a table on the left side of the room. He stood when Evelyn came in, and she read his face quickly. Controlled nerves, but underneath that something that resembled confidence. He gave her a short nod. Ira Callum was sitting in the chairs along the side wall. He was a heavy-set man in his late 60s with thick hands and white eyebrows, and when he saw Evelyn, he stood up and took his hat off, which was the kind of gesture that meant something from a man who had known Thomas Hartwell. She stopped in front of him. "Ira," she said. "Evelyn." He held his hat in both hands. "I should have come forward sooner. I want you to know I didn't know what he'd done, not until Abbott showed me those papers. I knew something felt wrong after the funeral, but He stopped. "I'm sorry." "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." Garland and his lawyer came in behind them and took their seats at the right-hand table. The lawyer was a man named Sherrill, who had the lean look of someone who won cases by making everything procedurally complicated, and he was already arranging papers with the efficiency of someone preparing for exactly that. Poole came in last, looking like a man attending his own sentencing, which Evelyn thought was perhaps not too far from accurate. Carver looked up when everyone was seated. He had a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but that the room arranged itself around automatically. "We're here to review the matter of Hartwell versus Hartwell, concerning the estate of the late Thomas Hartwell and the custody arrangement of his surviving dependents. I've reviewed the original petition and the subsequent documents submitted to this court." He paused and looked over the top of his papers at Poole. "I have some questions about the process by which those original documents were accepted, which we'll address as we go." He set the papers down. "Mr. Sherrill, your client has a claim. Present it." What followed was the part Evelyn had prepared for, but that still required everything she had to sit through. Sherrill presented Garland's position with the methodical confidence of a man who had, until 48 hours ago, believed he was standing on solid ground. The claim was the same claim that had worked on Poole. The estate was in Garland's name. The documents supported it. The widow had no legal standing to contest it. Carver listened without expression and made occasional notes and asked 2 questions. both of which were procedural and both of which caused Cheryl to pause slightly before answering. Then Abbott stood up. He was better than Evelyn had expected. She had hired him based on limited options and had spent the intervening weeks wondering if that had been a mistake, but standing in front of Judge Carver, Abbott found something he hadn't shown her before. He laid out the case clearly, the original deed, the legitimate will, the irregularities in the documents that had been submitted to the court. He presented the deed and the will. He explained the chain of custody, how Evelyn had described the lockbox, how the documents matched her description, how they had been recovered. He did not say how they had been recovered. Carver did not ask. Evelyn had the sense that Carver had already formed some opinion about how documents turn up after being allegedly lost, and that the opinion was not in Garland's favor. Then Abbott presented the draft documents. These were the ones that changed the room. Cheryl objected twice, provenance, authenticity, and Carver overruled him both times with the patient efficiency of a man who had seen this particular defense strategy before. He examined the drafts himself, holding them close and comparing them to the submitted letter with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely reading, not performing reading. "Mr. Cheryl," Carver said, "these documents appear to show the composition of the letter submitted to this court in multiple draft stages. The corrections in the margins are in the same hand as the submitted letter." He set them down. "That submitted letter is ostensibly signed by the deceased. Can you explain the existence of these drafts?" Cheryl said something about forgeries and recovered evidence and the unreliable nature of documents with uncertain provenance. He said it with less confidence than he'd said everything else. "I'll take that as a no," Carver said. Ira Callum was called next. He testified in the straightforward way of a man who had decided to tell the truth and had arrived at that decision with enough time to settle into it. He described witnessing Thomas Hartwell's will. He described the date, the circumstances, the specific language Thomas had used. He described Thomas's signature, which he'd watched being made. He identified the will Abbott had presented as the document he'd witnessed. Garland's lawyer cross-examined him for 20 minutes and got nothing useful. Callum was old and certain and didn't bend. Then Carver called Garland. Garland had been sitting at his table throughout with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to legal proceedings, which told Evelyn he had been in courtrooms before and knew how to hold himself. He took the stand without visible agitation. Carver questioned him directly and without apparent hostility, which was more unsettling than hostility would have been. He asked about the documents. He asked about the lockbox. He asked about the timeline. Specifically, he asked about the period between Thomas's death and the submission of the fraudulent letter to the court, and he asked Garland to account for his whereabouts and actions during that period in some detail. Garland's answers were careful. Too careful. The way answers are when someone has rehearsed them extensively and is now performing rehearsal rather than memory. Evelyn watched Carver's face and saw the judge registering this in the specific way judges do, with a quality of neutral attention that was actually far from neutral. At the end of Garland's testimony, Carver said, "One more question, Mr. Hartwell. The letter you submitted as evidence, the letter supposedly written and signed by your brother, do you know when it was written?" Garland said Thomas had written it during his illness, months before he died. "And were you present when he wrote it?" A pause. "No. He gave it to me after." "When after?" "Sometime after." "Before or after he signed the official will that's been presented here today?" Cheryl started an objection. Carver held up one hand and Cheryl sat back down. Garland said, carefully, "I don't know the exact dates." "That's interesting," Carver said, "because the official will presented today is dated 14 months before your brother's death and is witnessed by two individuals, one of whom just testified to its authenticity. The letter you submitted to this court is undated." He looked at Garland. "You submitted an undated document as evidence of your brother's final wishes against a dated, witnessed, properly registered will. Can you help me understand that?" Garland said something about Thomas's verbal instructions, about family discussions, about his understanding of what his brother had wanted. Carver listened to all of it. "Thank you," he said when Garland was done. "You can sit down." The ruling came after a 40-minute recess that was the longest 40 minutes Evelyn could remember. She sat in the hallway with her children and Cole and Abbott and Ira Callum and the town's curious population filtering past and she kept her back straight and her hands in her lap and said the right things to the children when they needed saying. Henry sat beside her and didn't speak. At some point he put his hand on her arm, briefly, awkward, the way 11-year-old boys do things they haven't planned to do, and then took it away. She put her hand over his for a moment before he withdrew it. He let her. Cole was standing against the wall across from her. He caught her eye once and said nothing with his face, which was exactly the right response. She didn't need reassurance right now. She just needed someone to be steady in the same space she was occupying. When Carver came back, the room settled within seconds. This court finds the document submitted in the original petition to be inauthentic, Carver said. He said it without drama, in the same even voice he'd used all morning. The letter, purportedly written by Thomas Hartwell, is inconsistent with the dated witnessed will presented by the opposing party, and the existence of draft documents bearing the same handwriting as the submitted letter raises significant questions of provenance and authenticity that this court cannot reconcile in the petitioner's favor. He paused and looked at his notes, and then looked up. The original deed to the Hartwell property is valid. The official will of Thomas Hartwell is valid. All assets belong to the estate of Thomas Hartwell as directed by that will, which designates Evelyn Hartwell as executor and primary beneficiary, with the property held in trust for the surviving children. The room was very quiet. Furthermore, Carver said, the court finds sufficient cause to refer the question of document fraud to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation. Magistrate Poole, this court will be reviewing the original acceptance of the fraudulent documents and your role in that process. He looked at Poole, who had the gray, slightly diminished look of a man whose position has just been cut out from under him. That review will begin next week. He set down his papers. Mrs. Hartwell, your property is restored. The custodial arrangement regarding your children is dissolved. The petition filed by Garland Hartwell is dismissed. He looked at her over the table. I'm sorry for the time this took. She said, Thank you, Your Honor. She said it steadily. She was not going to cry in the courtroom. She had decided that somewhere around 3 a.m. 2 nights ago, and she held to it now. Garland stood up from his table. His lawyer put a hand on his arm immediately, which suggested the lawyer had a better understanding of the situation than his client. Garland's face had lost its careful neutrality. The working expression was gone, and underneath it was something raw and recognizable as someone who has just watched a plan collapse that he'd spent months constructing. This isn't finished, Garland said. He said it to Evelyn, looking directly at her across the courtroom. You think this is finished, but Mr. Hartwell, Carver's voice cut across the room without being raised. You are advised by this court to consult with your legal counsel before speaking further in this proceeding. A pause. That is not a suggestion. Cheryl had his hand on Garland's arm and was speaking in his ear, and after a moment Garland sat back down. His eyes stayed on Evelyn. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to understand that she wasn't afraid of it anymore, and then she looked away. Not flinching, just done. There was nothing more she needed from looking at Garland Hartwell. Abbott was gathering his papers. Ira Callum was already on his feet, and when Evelyn turned, she found him beside her with his hat in his hands and his white eyebrows drawn together with something that was either emotion or the effort of controlling emotion. Thomas would have, he started and stopped. He was a good man, he said instead. The best I knew. Yes, she said, he was. The room was breaking apart around them, people moving and talking. Cole was making his way across from the wall where he'd stood for the entire proceeding, moving without urgency through the crowd. Daniel was beside her. She could feel all 6 of her children in the space around her the way you feel weather on your skin, a peripheral awareness that never fully went quiet. Clara tugged her sleeve. Mama, are we going home now? Evelyn looked down at her. Yes, baby, she said. We're going home. She meant Cole's ranch because that was where home was right now, and because Clara didn't need a longer answer than that. But as she said it, she was also thinking about the 240 acres that were legally hers again. The house Thomas had built board by board, the cottonwoods along the north fence. She was thinking about what it would take to go back there, whether she wanted to, what going back would mean against what staying at the Boulder Valley Ranch would mean, and she didn't have the answer to any of that yet. She didn't need the answer today. Cole reached her. He looked at her face, not asking anything, just looking. She was aware that her face was probably telling him more than she intended, because it did that when she was tired enough to stop managing it. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because she owed him honesty, almost, he nodded. He understood the difference. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold Caldwell Creek afternoon. The street was the same street it had always been. The same buildings, the same sky, the same mountains above the valley. The people who had watched the auction were some of them still here, watching again. She could feel it. The difference was that this time she was walking out with everything and not in pieces. And she was doing it on her own terms. And whatever anyone in this town thought about that, she found she had very little room left in her to care about it. Mrs. Copeland was standing outside her shop. She said, "Evelyn," when Evelyn passed. Evelyn stopped, looked at her. The older woman had a complicated expression on her face, something between relief and guilt, which was probably the right combination. "I'm glad it came out right," Copeland said. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She meant it, but she said it and kept walking, because gratitude for watching from the sidelines while someone else's life collapsed was the kind of thing that deserved acknowledgement and nothing more. Henry fell into step beside her. Without planning it, they matched pace. His stride had gotten longer in the past 3 weeks, she noticed. Longer and more deliberate, like someone practicing a walk they'd decided on. "It's over?" he said. "The court part is," she said. He thought about that for a block. "What's left?" "Deciding what comes next," she said, "which is different from being in danger, better different." He was quiet for another half block. "I like the ranch," he said, carefully, like he was confessing something. "I know," she said. "Cole's ranch, I mean, not—" He stopped. "Not instead of, just also." "I know what you mean, Henry." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to get his horse. She watched him go. 15 years ago, she'd been in a hospital room looking at a red-faced infant who screamed at everything, and she'd thought, "I don't know what I'm doing," and she still didn't know, most days, but she was doing it. Cole was behind her, a few steps back, giving her space while still being present. It was a thing she'd noticed he did. The precise calibration of available without crowding. She wondered if he knew he did it, or if it was simply built into how he moved through the world. She turned. "Let's go," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he smiled. A real one. Not the almost smile she'd been seeing for 3 weeks, but the thing underneath it, which was quieter and more genuine, and which did something uncomplicated to her chest. "Let's go," he agreed. They rode out of Caldwell Creek together, 8 people on horses and a wagon, north along the river road toward the mountains, toward a ranch that was warm and too big for 1 person and exactly right for 8. And the afternoon light came down through the valley in the thin gold way of winter light. Not warm, but bright. And the children talked on the ride back with the loosened voices of people who had been holding tension for hours and were now allowed to let it go. Evelyn rode at the front with Cole and let the voices wash over her and looked at the mountains getting larger ahead and let herself very slowly and with some effort begin to believe that it was actually over. The legal part. The desperate part. The part where she didn't know if she could keep them together. That part was done. What came next was a different kind of work entirely, and she found to her slight surprise that she was not afraid of it. The ride back from Caldwell Creek took 3 hours, same as it always did, but it felt different going north than it had going south that morning. Something had shifted in the quality of the air between the 8 of them. Not relief exactly, because relief implied that the tension was simply gone, and it wasn't simply gone. It was more like a rope that had been pulled taut for so long that when it finally slackened, the fibers didn't know how to lay flat anymore. They rode back through the valley with the court ruling in Abbott's satchel and the original documents against Evelyn's ribs, same place she'd carried them since the night of the break-in, and the conversation on the road was loose and intermittent, and mostly the children talking among themselves while the adults were quiet. Daniel rode beside Cole for most of the return. Evelyn noticed this from her position slightly ahead and didn't remark on it. She could see them in her peripheral vision, her son and this man, matching pace, not speaking much but occupying the same space without the careful distance Daniel had maintained for the first 2 weeks. Something had changed between them in the past 72 hours, though she couldn't have said exactly when. Maybe it was the night she and Cole had ridden out and Daniel had kept the fire going. and the doors locked and all 5 children calm until morning. Maybe it was when Cole had come back with blood on his face and hadn't made it dramatic. Maybe it was something smaller than either of those, something she hadn't witnessed. Children shifted their allegiances based on things adults never fully tracked. She'd learned that with Thomas, watching the children attached to him in ways that bore no obvious relationship to the grand gestures and everything to do with the small accumulated ones. The way he remembered which of them hated the crust on bread and always cut it off without being asked. The way he sat on the floor with them instead of the chair. The way he was simply, consistently, reliably there. Cole was there. Whatever else he was or wasn't, he was consistently, reliably there, and her children had registered that at some cellular level before their minds had caught up to it. She was still working out what she thought about that. The first thing they did when they got back to the ranch was nothing. This was deliberate. Cole put the horses away, and Evelyn made a pot of coffee, and the children dispersed into the house with the natural scatter of young people released from a long confined day. And for about 20 minutes, there was just the sound of the house re-inhabiting itself. Footsteps upstairs, Josiah's voice, Clara's laughter at something Ruth had said, the creak of the floorboards that Evelyn had memorized in the same way she'd memorized the ones at the Hartwell property. She was at the kitchen window with her coffee when Cole came in from the barn. He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, and they stood in the kitchen in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to process it aloud. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing its winter thing, coming in low and sideways, turning the snow on the mountains from white to something closer to gold, which never lasted more than 30 minutes but was worth looking at every time. "I need to think about the Hartwell property," she said eventually. "I know. The ruling restores it to the estate. That means it's mine to decide what to do with." She turned the cup in her hands. "I could go back." He said nothing to that. Not agreement, not disagreement. He was watching the window. "It's 240 acres, she continued. "Good land. Thomas broke it himself. The house is solid." She paused. "It's where we were." "Yes," he said. "But it's 3 hours from here." She looked at her coffee. "And your land is 310 acres, and it needs more hands than you have, and the children have been here for 3 weeks, and they've—" She stopped. "Henry hasn't stopped talking about that horse." "Wick has a long way to go," Cole said, "but Henry's got patience for it." "He doesn't have patience for anything else." She set her cup down. "I don't know what the right thing is. You don't have to know today." "I know that." She looked at him. "I'm thinking out loud." "I know you are." He turned from the window and looked at her directly. The cut above his eye had scabbed over in the past 2 days, and Margaret had made him keep a bandage on it, which he'd tolerated with the quiet resignation of a man who had learned to pick his battles. "Can I say something?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he got quiet when he was choosing words rather than reaching for them. "You could sell the Hartwell land," he said, "or lease it. There are families around Caldwell Creek who've been looking for property." He paused. "That money, combined with what this ranch produces, you wouldn't be dependent on anything uncertain." She looked at him. "That would mean staying here." "Yes," he said, "it would." The kitchen was very quiet. The house sounds continued around them. Josiah laughed at something. Ruth's voice rose briefly in what might have been a reprimand. The barn cat scratched at the back door and then gave up. The ordinary sounds of a house full of people. "Cole," she said. She said it carefully because she wanted to be careful. "I've been thinking about something you said the night we came back from the ranch, when we were on the road." He waited. "You said home," she said, "about this place. You didn't mean to say it, I don't think. It just came out." He looked at her. His expression was doing the thing it did when something had landed true, and he was deciding whether to meet it or redirect it. He met it. "No," he said. "I didn't mean to say it." "But you said it." "Yes." She picked up her coffee, put it down again. "I'm not good at this," she said, "talking about things that haven't been decided yet. I prefer to make a decision and then talk about it. I've noticed that about you. I'm working on changing it." She looked at him. "Cole, what do you want? Not what makes sense, not what the land math works out to. What do you want?" A long pause. Outside the window, the golden light on the mountains held for another few seconds and then began to go. This, he said, what we've had these past 3 weeks, all of it, the noise and the feeding 8 people instead of 1, and the kid who can't sleep past 5, and the one who argues with everything, and... He stopped. I've been alone for 8 years, and I'd made my peace with it, or I thought I had. And then I went to that auction and drove a wagon load of strangers up this road, and something... He shook his head slightly. I don't have better language for it than that. She was quiet for a moment. My husband died 4 months ago, she said. I want to be honest about that. I know. I'm not going to pretend I'm not still. She pressed her lips together. Thomas was a good man, one of the best I've known, and what I felt for him doesn't just stop because he's gone. That's not how it works. No, Cole said. I know that better than most. She thought of his wife, his 2 sons, 8 years of a large table set for one. I'm not asking you to stop, he said. I wouldn't want you to. A person who stops caring about someone they loved because that person died. He shook his head. That's not the kind of person I'd trust. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not Thomas. He was not trying to be Thomas, and he was not a replacement for Thomas, and she would not insult either of them by framing it that way, even in her own mind. He was Cole Mercer, who was patient and honest, and had arrived at an auction in the snow for reasons that he'd never fully explained, and that she'd eventually stop needing explained, because some things explained themselves over time better than they ever could in a single statement. I need more time, she said. I know, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They stood at the kitchen window and watched the last of the golden light leave the mountains and the evening come in gray and cold and ordinary, and neither of them said anything else about it, because it had been said, which was enough for now. The weeks that followed were the quietest Evelyn had experienced since before Thomas got sick. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind that comes when something that has been wrong for a long time is finally set right, and the people involved don't quite know what to do with the absence of emergency. The territorial prosecutor's office sent a man out in the 2nd week of February. He was a dry, precise man named Ellison, who asked questions with the manner of someone who already knew most of the answers and was confirming rather than discovering. He interviewed Evelyn for 2 hours. He interviewed Cole. He took the draft documents and a signed statement from Ira Callum and rode back to the Capitol with everything in a leather case. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived informing them that Garland Hartwell had been formally charged with document fraud and obstruction of court proceedings. He'd retained Cheryl to defend him, which Ellison's letter suggested would not be sufficient. The property question was settled. The criminal process would take longer, but it was in motion, and it was no longer Evelyn's problem to drive. She read that letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while the children were getting ready for the day, and then she folded it and put it in the small box where she kept important papers. The new box, the one Cole had given her, made of cedar with a proper lock. And she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and felt the exact shape of what it meant. It meant it was over. The part that had been trying to destroy them was finished. Whatever came after that was just life, with all the ordinary difficulty that entailed and none of the specific danger. She got up and made breakfast. It was Henry who asked the question directly, which surprised no one who knew Henry. It was a Saturday in late February, the kind of winter day that hints at spring without committing to it. A degree or 2 warmer than the weeks before, the snow on the southern slopes showing the first signs of softening. They'd all been outside most of the morning, and the kitchen at lunch had the comfortable chaos of 8 people tracking snow inside and arguing about who'd left the barn door unlatched and someone needing a dry pair of socks. When things had settled and food was on the table, Henry looked up from his plate and looked at Cole and said, "Are you going to marry my mother?" The table went very quiet. Margaret closed her eyes briefly in what appeared to be mortification. Daniel looked at his plate with the careful attention of someone studying the grain of the wood beneath it. Ruth had gone still. Josiah looked between Cole and his mother with the open interest of a 6-year-old who doesn't yet know that some questions are not asked at lunch. Evelyn looked at Henry. "That is not a question." "It's a reasonable question," Henry said. He said it without aggression, which was unusual for Henry. He wasn't being provocative. He was being, in his particular way, direct. We've been here 2 months. He's not going anywhere. Are you just going to not talk about it? Cole set down his fork. He looked at Henry for a moment. It's a reasonable question, he agreed. Henry looked at him. So? So it's not a decision I make by myself, Cole said. Or that your mother makes by herself. Or that you make by yourself, for that matter. Henry considered this. But you want to. A pause. Yes, Cole said. I want to. Henry turned and looked at his mother. His 11-year-old face was doing something complicated, cycling through emotions she recognized and some she couldn't name. Do you? He said. The table was waiting. All of them. Daniel still looking at his plate, but his body very still. Margaret with her hands in her lap. Ruth watching. Josiah eating because he was 6 and food was more immediate than most things. Evelyn looked at her son. She looked at Cole. She thought about what she'd said in the kitchen 2 months ago about needing more time, and about how time had an inconvenient way of passing regardless of whether you were done using it. Yes, she said, I do. Henry nodded once, satisfied, and went back to eating. The tension at the table dissolved into something lighter. Margaret let out a breath. Daniel looked up from his plate with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was no longer not a smile either. Ruth made a small sound that might have been relief or approval. Josiah asked if there was more bread. Cole looked at Evelyn across the table. His eyes were doing the thing she'd started to recognize, that steady warmth that he kept banked most of the time and occasionally let show. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at her own plate because there were 8 people in this kitchen, and she was not going to sit here going soft at the lunch table. Later, when the children were occupied elsewhere and the kitchen was quiet, Cole found her in the front room mending one of Josiah's shirts. He sat down across from her. He didn't have anything in his hands, which was unusual. Cole Mercer was a man who was always doing something with his hands. I should do this properly, he said. She looked up from the mending. He stopped, tried again. I'm not a man who talks well about personal things. You know that by now. I've noticed, she said. But I want to be clear about what I'm asking. It's not a business arrangement. It's not about the land or the children or what makes sense on paper. He looked at her directly. I want to be your husband. I want to be in this family, whatever that costs and however long it takes to get there properly. He paused. Will you marry me? She set the mending down in her lap. She thought about the auction, the cold street, a man at the back of a crowd saying, I'll take all of them in a voice that was unhurried, and the way she'd looked at him and tried to find the angle and couldn't, and how she'd followed him into the frozen wilderness with 6 children and her wits and a knife in her pocket because she was out of options, and he was what was in front of her. She thought about how little of that had turned out to be the truth of it. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, all right, the same way he said most things. Without performance, without excess. Just the fact of it, accepted. She picked up the mending again. He sat there for a moment more, and she could feel him smiling without looking up, which was a thing she found she didn't mind at all. They married in April when the first real thaw came, and the ground turned from iron to mud, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out their first tentative leaves. Evelyn had not wanted a large ceremony, and Cole had not wanted any ceremony, and they'd compromised on something in between. A gathering at the ranch, a few dozen people, the kind of thing that is more celebration than performance. The guest list assembled itself in the way guest lists do when a story has spread through a community. Ira Callum came, and his wife, and they brought a pie that was slightly lopsided but tasted right. Abbott came and shook Cole's hand and told Evelyn she was one of the most competent people he'd ever worked with, which she took as the sincere compliment it was. Mrs. Copeland came, which Evelyn noted without particular warmth but without coldness either. Some people from the Boulder Valley, neighbors of Cole's who had been watching from a respectful distance for months, came with food and handshakes and the straightforward goodwill of people who were glad the man they'd known to be lonely for 8 years had apparently stopped being so. Hector Finley came, and Cale Finley, who stood very straight and seemed aware of the small role he'd played in the chain of events, and was quietly pleased with it. The Hartwell property had been leased the previous month to a young family from Nebraska who'd been looking for land and had the means to work it properly. The money from the lease went into a joint account that Evelyn and Cole had established at the bank in Caldwell Creek, and Evelyn had sat across from the bank clerk and signed her name on the account, and felt something clarify in her chest. Not the relief of rescue, but the different and more durable feeling of having built a floor under yourself with your own hands. She and Cole had spent 3 weeks in February and March expanding the Boulder Valley Ranch. Not grandly, not all at once, but with the specific additions that 8 people required that one person didn't: a third room upstairs, a proper pantry, a new section of fence on the south pasture that Cole and Daniel had built together over the course of 8 cold days, and which Evelyn had watched from the window on the last day when they came back inside arguing, mildly but genuinely, about the correct way to set a corner post. And she'd stood at the window watching her 15-year-old son argue with this man as if they'd been doing it for years. It wasn't her house yet, not fully. Maybe it never would be in the way the Hartwell place had been. That was where she'd been young, where Thomas had been alive, where all 6 children had been born. Some places you don't get a second version of, but this was a real place, with real people in it, and it was hers, and she was finding that real was better than the word she'd been looking for. The ceremony itself was short and imperfect in the specific ways that real things are imperfect. Clara cried, not from sadness, but from the excitement of being dressed up, and the crying was contagious in the way 4-year-old crying always is. And for about 3 minutes in the middle of the proceedings, the front room was a minor chaos that neither Evelyn nor Cole had accounted for. Evelyn laughed, which surprised her. Cole looked at her laughing, and something moved across his face that she would remember later as the moment she stopped thinking of him as someone she was learning to trust and started thinking of him as simply hers. Daniel stood at the back of the room with his arms folded in the way he had when he was feeling something he hadn't decided how to display. And Evelyn caught his eye once during the ceremony, and he gave her a nod that contained a large amount of things she didn't need him to say out loud. He was going to be all right. She had known it for a while, but the nod confirmed it. Henry stood next to Daniel. He didn't fold his arms. He watched the whole thing with that direct attention he gave to things he'd decided mattered, and he cried once, briefly, which he would deny for years afterward, and which she would never contradict him about. Some dignities deserved protecting. Ruth held Josiah's hand throughout. Josiah kept trying to turn around and look at the guests. Margaret stood closest to Evelyn, slightly behind her right shoulder, the way she'd stood for months, present and available without being intrusive. When it was over and people were moving and talking, Margaret hugged her quickly, hard, without a word, and then stepped back and straightened her dress, and was composed again. Which was so perfectly Margaret that Evelyn had to look away. Cole's hand in hers was warm and calloused and certain, which seemed like the right combination. That summer was the first summer in years that Evelyn worked without fear underneath the work. There was still hard work. There was always hard work on a ranch. The kind that started before light and didn't finish until after dark, and didn't pause for weather or feeling or anything else. The Boulder Valley land needed what all frontier land needed: constant tending, constant attention, the kind of physical labor that doesn't ask you how you feel about it. She didn't mind. She had never minded the work itself. What she'd minded was doing it while holding dread in her chest like a second occupation. The dread was gone. What replaced it wasn't ease, exactly. Life at 34 with 6 children and a new husband and 310 acres was not something anyone could reasonably call easy. But it was solid. It had a foundation under it that she'd helped build and could see and touch and trust, and that was a different category entirely. Cole was a better partner than she had calculated. She'd calculated for decent, honest and hardworking and reliable, because those were the things that mattered, and she'd been right to weight them heavily. What she hadn't fully calculated for was the way he paid attention to things without announcing that he was paying attention, the way he rearranged his schedule around hers without either of them discussing it, so that they were rarely both away from the house at the same time, the way he noticed when she was tired before she acknowledged it herself and didn't say anything about it, but happened to take over whatever she was doing. He wasn't showy about it. He was just competent in the way that people who have been taking care of themselves for a long time are competent, and that competence extended now to the family around him. He was not Thomas. She had known that, and she continued to know it, and it continued to be not the simple thing she'd once thought it was. Loving a second person didn't diminish the first one. It turned out you didn't have a fixed amount of it that got divided. You had something more like a capacity that grew in response to what it was asked to hold. She had not known that before this year. She thought she might spend the rest of her life working out all the things this year had taught her that she hadn't known she needed to learn. In the autumn, when the aspens on the mountain above the ranch went, the color they always went in October, that particular orange that didn't look like any other orange, too bright for comfort, Evelyn sat on the porch in the evening with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and looked at the mountains and thought about the auction. It had been almost a year since the street in Caldwell Creek, the cold and the crowd and Garland's careful face, the moment she'd understood that everything was going to be taken from them, and there was nothing she could do about it. A year since a stranger's voice from the back of a crowd had changed the shape of the next 12 months. She thought about what that woman on the street had been carrying. The $260 sewn into her coat, the 6 children pressed against her, the precise, managed terror of someone who has identified that she cannot afford to be seen to be terrified. She didn't feel contempt for that woman. She felt something more complicated, a kind of tenderness almost. That woman had been doing the only thing available to her, which was holding herself together through main force while she waited for the next step to appear. There was no wisdom in it and no strategy. There was just endurance, which is not a plan, but is sometimes the thing that gets you to the place where a plan becomes possible. She thought about the things she'd learned this year that she couldn't have been told, that desperation doesn't have to be the end of the story, that the stranger in the back of the crowd is sometimes exactly what they appear to be. The children are more resilient than their parents fear and more perceptive than their parents know, and that they will tell you what they need if you create the conditions for them to say it. Henry, at the lunch table, asking the direct question no one else had asked, and the way the room had shifted after. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. She'd thought she knew. She'd belonged to the Hartwell land for 18 years and had believed that belonging was located in a place, a specific set of acres with specific cottonwoods along the north fence, and a specific house with a warped floor and her children's names carved into the doorframe where Thomas had marked their heights every birthday. She'd believed that when she lost the land, she lost the belonging. She'd been wrong about where belonging lives, or not wrong exactly. It had lived there. It did live in places and things and history, but it also lived in people, and in what people built between themselves when the circumstances were right or wrong enough to make them build it, and in the way a family you hadn't planned on became the family you couldn't imagine not having. The door behind her opened. Cole came out with his own cup and sat down in the other chair on the porch. He looked at the aspens. She looked at the aspens. "It's a good color this year," he said. "It's a good color every year," she said. "More than usual." She looked at the mountains. He was right. The orange was particularly sharp this year, set against the blue of the sky in a way that seemed almost aggressive. "Yes," she said, "more than usual." They sat in the evening for a while without talking. This was one of the things she'd come to value most. The ability to be in a silence together that wasn't waiting for anything. She'd been in a lot of silences in the past year that were full of waiting. This was different. This was just 2 people on a porch at the end of a day, watching the light go out of the mountains. Behind them, through the door, the house was noisy with the particular noise of evening. Clara's voice carrying above the others the way it always did. Josiah's running footsteps. The sound of pots from the kitchen where Margaret and Ruth were doing something that involved occasional disagreement. Daniel's voice saying something low and settling. Henry was probably still in the barn. Henry was always in the barn lately, and Wick the bad-tempered bay had started meeting him at the stall door, which Cole called progress and Henry called inevitable. "Cole," she said. Do you ever think about—" She stopped, tried to find the right shape for what she was asking. "When you drove that wagon to the auction, what did you think was going to happen?" He considered this. He was a man who considered things before answering, which she had initially found slow and now found essential. "I didn't think that far ahead," he said. "I knew what was happening was wrong, and I knew I was in a position to do something about it. I didn't plan past the auction." "You didn't think about what you were taking on." "No. That's not like you," she said. "You plan everything." "I know." He looked at his cup. "I think I knew, some part of me, that if I thought too much about it, I'd talk myself out of it. I'd find the practical reasons why it wasn't my business and why someone else would handle it and why it wasn't sensible for a man alone on a ranch to... He stopped. So I didn't think. I just went. She held that. I'm glad you did. So am I. He said it simply, without drama. I was terrified of you, she said, that first week. Not of you specifically, of what you might want, what the cost was going to be. I kept looking for the angle. I know you were. You weren't offended? He shook his head. You had 6 children and a man had just stolen your life. Being suspicious of a stranger who showed up with money and offered you a solution was... He looked at her. That was intelligence, not insult. Most men would have been offended. Most men would have wanted something that would have given them reason to be suspicious. He said it without self-congratulation. Just the fact of it. She looked at the mountains. The orange was fading now, deepening toward brown as the light failed, and the first stars were arriving above the eastern ridge. She thought about Thomas. She thought about what Thomas would make of this porch, this man, this view. She thought he would have approved. She thought he would have been glad to know she'd found solid ground again, not instead of what they'd built together, but after it, which was how things worked when you were lucky and kept going. The door opened and Clara appeared in it, 4 years old and already in her nightgown and unwilling to be separated from the evening without registering her objection. Mama, Clara said, it's dark. Almost, Evelyn said. Not quite. Margaret says to come in. Margaret's right. Give us a minute. Clara considered whether this was acceptable. She looked at Cole. Your coffee's cold, she said, which was accurate, and then she went back inside. Cole looked at Evelyn, the not-quite smile. We should go in, she said. We should, he agreed, and neither of them moved for another moment. She sat on that porch and looked at the last light on the mountains and thought about the things you only understand after you've been through them. That the worst period of your life is not necessarily a wrong turn. That people appear in the places you'd never have chosen to be. That belonging isn't something you have until it's something you build. And that building it requires exactly the things you spend your whole life hoping you won't need. Loss and endurance and the willingness to follow a stranger's wagon into the snow when every careful instinct says otherwise. She didn't know what the next year would bring. She knew the ranch needed a new water line run to the south pasture. She knew Daniel had started talking about eventually getting land of his own, which she received with the bittersweet pride of a mother who has done her job well enough that her children can imagine their own futures. She knew Henry and Wick were going to be a matched pair by spring, which would make Henry insufferable on the subject, and she would love every minute of it. She knew Josiah had started asking Cole about the cattle with the specific kind of focused interest that looked, the more she watched it, like someone who would one day want to know everything about how a ranch ran and why. She knew Margaret would be fine in a way that required no elaboration, because Margaret was always going to be fine, and Ruth would be fine in a quieter way, and Clara would be fine in the loudest possible way for the foreseeable future. She knew this was her life now. Not the one she'd built with Thomas, not the one she'd had before the hard year. A different one. A new one, with new people and new land and a husband who had come from outside any plan she'd made and had turned out to be exactly what none of them had known they needed. She had not survived the winter by being rescued. She needed to be clear about that, to herself if to no one else, because the story could be told that way, and she refused to let it. She had survived the winter by refusing to let her children be split up, and by thinking clearly under pressure, and by being willing to ride through the dark toward something she was afraid of because the alternative was worse. Cole had made the path possible, but she had walked it every step with her own feet. That was the thing she would carry longest, she thought. Not the land or the legal victory or even the warmth of the house behind her full of children who were whole and safe. It was the knowledge of what she was capable of when the circumstances demanded it, and the understanding that that knowledge couldn't be taken from her the way land could be taken or papers could be forged. It lived in her. She'd earned it in a specific hard way, and it was hers. The last light left the mountains. The stars were out in earnest now, the same hard, brilliant winter stars she'd watched from a wagon seat a year ago, going north toward an unknown ranch with 6 frightened children and a stranger holding the reins. She was still going north. She would always be going north, in the direction of whatever came next, because that was what you did when you were still alive and the road was still in front of you. She got up from the chair, Cole got up beside her. They went inside to the noise and the warmth and the children, and behind them the door closed against the night, and the fire was going in the hearth, and the house was full. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.